Good evening, and welcome back. Have you ever wondered why people separated by oceans and mountains, who never met and never spoke each other's languages, all told stories of a great flood that drowned the world? What if the oldest libraries buried beneath the sands of Iraq hold not just one culture's memory, but a whisper of something that touched the whole human family when the earth was young and the waters rose higher than anyone had imagined possible? If you find yourself here tonight, drawn to the quiet corners of the past, and if these long journeys through ancient worlds help you rest, then please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to the channel. Do it only if it feels right, only if these stories genuinely bring you peace. And if you feel like sharing, drop a comment below telling us where you are in the world right now and what time it is as you listen. It's always a comfort to know we're scattered across time zones yet gathered here in the same stillness. Now before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Turn on a fan if you like that soft hum in the background. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow and deepen. There's no rush tonight. We have time, and the story will unfold at its own pace. Now let's ease into tonight's journey together. The land we call Mesopotamia lies between two rivers. In the languages spoken there long ago, the word for river and the word for life were never far apart. The Tigris and the Euphrates descend from the highlands to the north, carving their way through plateaus and plains, carrying snowmelt and spring rain, dragging silt and clay and the broken stems of reeds, until finally they slow and spread across a flat world where the horizon seems impossibly distant and the sky takes up more space than the earth. It is a land that was made by water, shaped by water, and throughout its long history, menaced and blessed by water in equal measure. If you had stood there 7,000 years ago, or 8, or 9, before the first cities rose and before the first king's name was scratched into wet clay, you would have seen a landscape that shifted with the seasons. In the dry months, the ground baked hard and pale, cracked into polygons shimmering with heat. Dust moved in lazy spirals. The riverbeds shrank and exposed wide margins of cracked mud where waterbirds stepped carefully, probing for the last of the small creatures trapped in shrinking pools. In the wet months, everything changed. The rivers swelled, the low places filled, marshes spread across the land, thick with reeds taller than a man, loud with frogs and insects, crossed by narrow channels where people moved in boats made from bundled reeds, lashed together with rope of woven fibre. The people who lived there were not the Sumerians yet, not in name, not in the way we would later recognise them. They were farmers and fishers, herders of goats and sheep, gatherers of wild grains and the eggs of waterfowl. They built their homes from what the land offered, which was mud and reeds and little else. There was no stone to quarry, no forest to harvest for timber, so they learned to shape the mud into bricks, drying them in the sun, stacking them into low walls, roofing their houses with bundles of reeds laid across wooden poles brought from far away at great effort and expense. The houses were small and dim inside, cool in the heat of the day, warmed by small fires at night when the temperature dropped and the wind came in from the north or west. They planted barley and emmer wheat in fields that depended entirely on the flooding of the rivers. There were no mountains nearby to catch reliable rain. The rain that fell was sparse and erratic, arriving in brief winter storms that soaked the ground and then vanished for months. Everything depended on the rivers, and the rivers depended on distant mountains the people had never seen. The water came down each year in late spring and early summer, fed by melting snow in the highlands of Anatolia and the Zagros range. When the floods came gently, spreading across the fields in shallow sheets, soaking the soil, leaving behind a fresh layer of silt rich in minerals, the harvests were good. When the floods came too hard, too fast, too high, they tore away the fieldworks, drowned the stored grain, collapsed the walls of homes and carried off livestock and sometimes people. The people learned to read the rivers. They watched the colour of the water, the speed of the current, the height of the flow against the banks. They learned which years brought gentle floods and which brought danger, though they could never predict with certainty. They built their villages on low mounds, raising the ground beneath their homes one basket of earth at a time, generation by generation, so that the houses stood above the normal floodline. But normal was a relative term. There were years when the water rose higher than memory, higher than the mounds, higher than the rooftops. In those years, the people retreated to whatever high ground they could find, or they took to their boats and waited, floating above their drowned fields, watching the water lap against the walls of their homes, hoping the walls would hold. They brought with them what they could carry: seed grain for the next planting, a few tools, their children, perhaps a goat or a lamb small enough to lift into the boat. They left behind everything else. When the waters receded, they returned to find their homes filled with mud, their stored food spoiled, their careful work undone. Then they began again, scooping out the mud, rebuilding the walls, replanting the fields. This was the rhythm of life in the land between the rivers, a rhythm of building and losing and building again. The memory of these floods lived in the bodies of the people before it lived in words. It lived in the way a mother clutched her child when the river's sound changed in the night. It lived in the habit of storing grain in jars sealed with bitumen and clay, in the practice of keeping a boat ready even when the skies were clear. It lived in the songs sung at planting time, songs that asked the gods to hold back the waters or to send them gently. It lived in the dreams of old men who had survived the great flood of their youth and who woke sometimes in the dark, heart racing, thinking they heard the roar of water, though the night was perfectly still. As the centuries passed, the people began to gather in larger groups. Small villages grew into towns. Some towns grew into cities. Families became clans. Clans became tribes. Tribes became temple communities centered on a particular god or goddess, who was believed to dwell in a particular place and to hold a particular power over the world. The people built temples, raising them on high platforms of brick so that the gods would not be touched by floodwaters. They built granaries and workshops, marketplaces and canals. They dug channels to guide the water where they wanted it to go, and they built low walls of earth and stone to keep it away from where they did not. They were learning to shape the land, but they never forgot that the land could also shape them, could undo in a single season what had taken lifetimes to build. Language became more complex. People needed words for new things, new relationships, new transactions. A farmer needed to tell his neighbour where the boundary of the field lay. A merchant needed to record how much grain had been traded for how many jars of oil. A priest needed to remember the names of the gods, the proper words of the hymns, the sequence of the rituals. At first, these things were held in memory, passed from one person to another by voice, by repetition, by the discipline of listening and remembering. But memory was fragile. Memory could be lost when a person died, or when a community was scattered, or when a flood drowned a town and the survivors had to start over somewhere else, with only what they could carry in their heads. So the people invented writing. It happened slowly, over generations, beginning as simple marks pressed into clay to count jars of grain or head of sheep. A curved line meant one thing, a cluster of lines meant another. The marks became more elaborate, representing not just objects but sounds, and then combinations of sounds that could capture the flow of speech. The wet clay tablets were left to dry in the sun or baked in ovens, turning them hard and permanent. For the first time, memory could be stored outside the human body. A man could die, but his words could remain, pressed into clay, waiting in the dark of a temple archive for someone generations later to read them again. Among the earliest things written down were lists, inventories, contracts, the practical records of who owed what to whom. But soon the scribes began to write down the old stories, the ones that had been sung and spoken for as long as anyone could remember. They wrote down hymns to the gods, they wrote down the deeds of kings, and they wrote down the story of the flood, the great flood, the flood that came before the cities, before the kings, before the world as they knew it. They wrote it down because it mattered, because it was a story their ancestors had told, and because they believed it held a truth that should not be forgotten. The story, as the Sumerians told it, began with the gods. In the time before the flood, the world was young and the gods were many, each with a role, each with desires and jealousies and plans. The people of the earth were numerous, and they were loud. They worked and shouted and sang and quarrelled, and the noise of them rose up to the heavens and disturbed the rest of the gods. One god in particular, a god of storms and wind, grew weary of the clamour. He proposed a solution. Let the people be silenced. Let a flood come and sweep them away so that the heavens could be quiet again. But not all the gods agreed. One god, a god of wisdom and water, a god who had helped shape humanity and who felt a kinship with them, decided to warn one man. The name of this man was written in the oldest fragments as Ziusudra, though later peoples would know him by other names. The god came to him, perhaps in a dream, perhaps in the rustling of reeds beside a riverbank, and told him what was coming. "Build a boat," the god said. "Make it large and strong. Bring into it the seed of all living things, your family, your animals, the plants that sustain you. Seal it with bitumen so the water cannot enter. Do this quickly, and do not speak of it to others, for the decision of the gods is final and the flood will not be turned aside." Ziusudra, according to the story, obeyed. He built the boat, though his neighbours must have thought him mad, building such a vessel on dry land far from the river's edge. He gathered what he was told to gather. He brought his wife and his sons' wives, perhaps his daughters too, though the texts do not say. He brought goats and sheep, cattle and birds, jars of grain and oil and beer, tools and seed, and all the knowledge he carried in his hands and head. When the boat was ready and the sky began to darken, he sealed the door from the inside with bitumen and pitch, closing himself and his family and the animals into the dark hold, and he waited. The rain began. It fell softly at first, then harder still, until the sound of it against the roof of the boat was like the roar of a river in flood. The rivers rose, the canals overflowed, the fields vanished beneath the water. The low places filled first, then the high places, then even the mounds where the temples stood. The water climbed the walls of the cities and poured through the streets and into the houses, driving people onto their roofs and then higher, onto the rooftops of the tallest buildings, and then there was nowhere left to go. The water kept rising. It covered the land completely. It drowned the cities and the fields and the hills beyond. The boat floated free, lifted by the flood, tossed by waves that in the flatness of Mesopotamia had no shores to break against. Inside, Ziusudra and his family felt the boat rock and shudder, heard the water slap against the hull, and smelled the damp air thick with the breath of frightened animals. For days the rain continued. Some texts say 7 days and 7 nights. Others say longer. Time lost meaning in the darkness of the sealed boat. There was no sunrise to mark the days, no sunset to mark the nights. There was only the endless drumming of rain, and the motion of the water beneath them, and the knowledge that outside the world they had known was being unmade. When the rain finally stopped, the silence must have been startling. The boat drifted on a vast stillness. Slowly, over days or weeks, the water began to recede. The boat came to rest on a mountainside or a hill, some high place where the water drained away first. Ziusudra opened a window and sent out a bird to see if the earth had reappeared. The bird flew away and did not return, or it returned and he sent another, testing the world, waiting for the sign that it was safe to emerge. When at last he opened the door and stepped out onto the muddy ground, he saw a world scoured clean. The cities were gone. The fields were buried. The people who had filled the land with their noise and labour were gone, all but the few who stood with him beside the beach boat. He built an altar from whatever stones he could find. He made an offering to the gods, burning incense and animal fat, sending the smoke up into the clearing sky. The gods, smelling the offering, gathered above him. They saw what had been done and they were moved, some with regret, some with relief. The god who had sent the flood saw that life had been preserved and made a promise. Never again would such a flood be sent. A rainbow appeared, or some sign in the sky, a mark of the covenant between the gods and the survivors. Ziusudra and his family went forth to repopulate the earth, to plant new fields, to rebuild what had been lost. This is the story as the Sumerians wrote it, pressed into clay in a script that looked like wedges and nails and bird tracks, kept in the temple archives of cities like Eridu and Nippur and Uruk. But it was not only the Sumerians who told this story. As the scribes and scholars of later centuries began to read the writings of other peoples, they found the same story told again and again in languages scattered across the world, in places so distant from Mesopotamia that no traveller of the ancient world could have walked from one to the other in a lifetime. The story travelled, or perhaps it was never just one story, but many stories born from the same deep human experience. As the Sumerian cities grew and their influence spread, the tale of the flood was adopted and adapted by those who came after. The Akkadians, a Semitic people who moved into the southern plains and mingled with the Sumerians, took the story and rewrote it in their own language. They changed the name of the flood hero. Where the Sumerians had called him Ziusudra, the Akkadians called him Atrahasis, which meant the exceedingly wise one. The shape of the story remained largely the same, but the details shifted to reflect Akkadian sensibilities, their particular relationships with their gods, their own memories of the land and the water. In the Atrahasis epic, the flood was not merely a response to human noise, it was the culmination of a longer tension between the gods and humanity. The gods had created people to do the work the lesser gods had grown tired of doing, digging canals and tending fields and maintaining the temples. But humanity multiplied and filled the earth, and their labour, their voices, their very presence became overwhelming. The gods tried other solutions first. They sent plague, they sent drought, they sent famine. Each time Atrahasis, guided by the god Enki, found a way to appease the gods and save his people. Finally, the god Enlil, frustrated and weary, decided on the flood as a final solution. Enki, unwilling to see humanity destroyed, whispered the warning to Atrahasis through the wall of a reed hut, instructing him in the building of the boat, the gathering of life, the sealing of the door. The Akkadian version preserved details the Sumerian fragments had lost or never recorded. It described the dimensions of the boat, its shape, the amount of bitumen used to seal the seams. It described the terror of the storm, the darkness that swallowed the world, the gods themselves cowering in fear at the violence of the flood they had unleashed. When the waters receded and Atrahasis emerged to make his offering, the gods gathered around the smoke like flies, hungry and grateful, realizing too late that they had nearly destroyed the very beings who sustained them with worship and sacrifice. The goddess Ninhursag, mother of humanity, wept and swore she would remember this day forever, that she would wear her lapis lazuli necklace as a reminder never to forget what had been done. Centuries passed. Empires rose in Mesopotamia and pressed outward, carrying their stories and gods with them. The Babylonians, heirs to the Akkadians and Sumerians, wove the flood story into their greatest literary achievement, the Epic of Gilgamesh. In this telling, the flood was not the central event but a story within a story, told by a character named Utnapishtim to the hero Gilgamesh, who had journeyed to the ends of the earth seeking the secret of immortality. Utnapishtim was the flood survivor, the man who had been granted eternal life by the gods as a reward for preserving the seed of life through the deluge. He told Gilgamesh how the gods had decided to destroy the world, how Enki had warned him, how he had built the boat and loaded it with his family and animals and craftsmen, sealing them all inside as the storm descended. The Babylonian account gave the flood a visceral power. It described the roar of the storm as the voice of the god Adad, the lightning that turned night into day, the wind that shattered the land like a pot. It described how even the gods were terrified, retreating to the highest heaven, crouching like dogs against the outer wall. It described the silence after the storm, the stillness of the drowned world, the boat resting on Mount Nimush, and the birds sent out one by one to test the receding waters. A dove flew out and found nowhere to land, so it returned. A swallow flew out and also returned. Finally, a raven flew out and did not come back, for it had found land and carrion to feed upon. Utnapishtim knew then that the earth was habitable again. He opened the boat and released the animals and made his offering, and the gods, smelling the sweet savour, gathered above him and blessed him with the gift of immortality, though they decreed he must live forever at the edge of the world, far from other men. The story was copied and recopied, tablet after tablet, scribe after scribe, in the schools where young boys learned to write by reproducing the classics. It was carried across borders by merchants and diplomats. It was read in the courts of Assyrian kings in the north, where the libraries of Nineveh held thousands of tablets covering every subject known to the learned men of the age. When archaeologists in the 19th century uncovered those libraries, buried under the rubble of a city destroyed 25 centuries earlier, they found among the tablets a nearly complete version of the Gilgamesh epic, and within it, the flood story, written in Akkadian cuneiform, still legible, still powerful. But Mesopotamia was not the only place where such a story was told. Far to the west, the Hebrew people, who had their own complex relationship with Mesopotamia, their own memories of migration and exile, told a flood story that resembled the Babylonian account so closely that scholars would spend generations debating the connections. In the Hebrew scriptures, the flood survivor was called Noah, a righteous man in a corrupt generation. The God of the Hebrews, singular and absolute, looked upon the earth and saw that humanity had become wicked, violent, filled with evil thoughts and deeds. He regretted having made them. He decided to wipe the earth clean and begin again. But Noah found favor in his eyes. God instructed Noah to build an ark, giving him precise measurements. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, with 3 decks and a door in the side and a window near the top. Noah built the ark, though it took him many years, and he brought into it his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, and pairs of every kind of animal, 7 pairs of the clean animals and 1 pair of the unclean, and food enough to sustain them all. When they were sealed inside, the rain began. The springs of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened, and water poured onto the earth from above and below. For 40 days and 40 nights the rain fell. The waters rose higher than the tallest mountains. Everything that breathed air and walked on dry land perished. Only Noah and those with him in the ark survived. The ark floated on the face of the waters, a tiny vessel of life adrift on a drowned planet. When the rain stopped, the waters lingered for months, covering the earth, slowly receding as God sent a wind to pass over the waters. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah opened the window and sent out a raven, which flew back and forth until the waters dried up. Then he sent out a dove. The dove found no place to rest and returned. He waited 7 days and sent the dove out again. This time it returned with a freshly plucked olive leaf, a sign that the waters had receded enough for trees to emerge. He waited another 7 days and sent the dove out once more, and it did not return. Noah removed the covering of the ark and saw that the ground was dry. God told him to come out, to release the animals, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth again. Noah built an altar and offered sacrifices, and God smelled the pleasing aroma and promised never again to curse the ground or destroy all living creatures. As a sign of this covenant, God set a rainbow in the sky, a reminder that the waters would never again rise to cover the earth. The similarities between the Hebrew account and the Mesopotamian versions are undeniable. Both involve a righteous man warned by a deity. Both describe a boat built to specific divine instructions. Both include the gathering of animals and family, the sealing of the vessel, the onset of a catastrophic flood, the eventual receding of the waters, the sending of birds to test for dry land, the offering of a sacrifice, and the promise of divine protection against future floods. Scholars have long debated whether the Hebrew scribes borrowed from Babylonian sources during the period of the Babylonian exile, or whether both traditions drew from an older shared memory, or whether the parallels reflect independent responses to similar environmental realities. The answer remains uncertain, and perhaps the uncertainty itself is instructive, reminding us that stories do not belong to single peoples, but flow across borders and centuries like the very waters they describe. Beyond the Fertile Crescent, the flood story appeared in forms both familiar and strange. The ancient Greeks told of Deucalion, son of Prometheus, who survived a great flood sent by Zeus to destroy a corrupt and violent human race. Warned by his father, Deucalion built a chest, a floating container, and took refuge in it with his wife Pyrrha. For 9 days and 9 nights the rain fell and the waters rose, drowning all but the highest peaks. When the flood subsided, Deucalion's chest came to rest on Mount Parnassus. He and Pyrrha emerged and made offerings to Zeus, who sent the messenger god Hermes to grant them a wish. They asked for humanity to be restored. They were instructed to throw the bones of their mother over their shoulders. Understanding that the bones of their mother, the earth, were stones, they did so, and the stones Deucalion threw became men, and the stones Pyrrha threw became women, and the world was repopulated. In India, the ancient texts called the Puranas and the Mahabharata told of Manu, the first man, who was warned of a coming deluge by a small fish he had saved from death. The fish grew larger and larger, eventually revealing itself as the god Vishnu in his Matsya, or fish, avatar. Vishnu instructed Manu to build a great boat and to bring into it the 7 sages and seeds of all plants and pairs of all animals. When the flood came, the waters rose until they covered the whole earth, even the highest mountains. Manu's boat floated on the endless ocean. The great fish reappeared, and Manu tied the boat to the fish's horn, and the fish towed the boat safely through the flood until the waters receded and the boat came to rest on a mountaintop. From Manu, humanity descended once more. In China, ancient accounts spoke of the Great Flood during the reign of the legendary Emperor Yao. The waters rose and covered the land, inundating hills and mountains, threatening to drown civilization. A hero named Gun was tasked with controlling the flood, but he failed and was executed. His son, Yu the Great, took up the task and succeeded by dredging channels and building dikes, guiding the waters back into their proper courses and making the land habitable again. Yu's success was so celebrated that he became emperor and founded the Xia dynasty. The Chinese flood story differed from the others in that it emphasized human ingenuity and labor over divine salvation, yet the core motif remained: a world-threatening deluge and the survival of humanity through the actions of a single righteous or capable figure. Across the ocean, among the indigenous peoples of the Americas, flood stories appeared with startling frequency. The Ojibwe told of a time when the world was covered by water and the trickster figure Nanabojo, stranded on a log with a few animals, sent down an otter and a beaver, and finally a muskrat to dive deep and bring up a bit of earth, which he used to recreate the land. The Hopi told of previous worlds destroyed by water, with only a few people saved by climbing into hollow reeds that floated on the surface. The Inca remembered a great flood sent by the god Viracocha to destroy a wicked people, with only 2 survivors who repopulated the earth. The Mapuche of Chile spoke of a battle between 2 serpents that caused the sea to rise and flood the land, with survivors taking refuge on a mountaintop. The Aztec traditions included cycles of creation and destruction, one of which involved a flood that turned people into fish. Even in Australia, among the Aboriginal peoples whose cultures stretch back tens of thousands of years, there are stories of great floods and rising seas. The Gunditjmara people of southeastern Australia recall a time when the sea rose and drowned coastal plains, forcing people to move to higher ground. These stories, passed down through countless generations, may preserve memories of the end of the last ice age, when melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise and inundate vast areas of land that had been dry and inhabited. The question that has occupied scholars, theologians, and scientists for centuries is this: why do so many cultures, separated by vast distances and isolated from one another for millennia, tell stories of a great flood? Is it coincidence? Is it evidence of a single historical event so catastrophic that its memory spread across the entire human family? Is it the result of independent experiences of local flooding, each culture elevating its own disaster into a cosmic event? Or is it something deeper, something woven into the structure of human consciousness, a narrative archetype born from our shared vulnerability to the forces of nature? Some have argued for a literal global flood, an event that covered the entire Earth and destroyed all life except what survived in a single vessel. This interpretation, rooted in religious tradition, faces significant challenges from geology, paleontology, and physics. There is no geological evidence for a worldwide flood in recent human history. The fossil record does not show a single mass extinction event that correlates with the flood narratives. The amount of water required to cover the highest mountains does not exist on Earth, and if it did, the mechanisms for such water to appear and then disappear remain unexplained by natural processes. Others have proposed that the flood stories reflect memories of real, but localized catastrophic events. In Mesopotamia, devastating floods were not only possible but regular, and a particularly severe flood could have seemed, to the people experiencing it, like the end of the world. If such a flood wiped out multiple cities and drowned the entire visible horizon, survivors would understandably have believed that the whole Earth had been submerged. This memory, preserved in oral tradition and eventually written down, could have been passed to neighbouring cultures through trade, conquest, and migration. The Hebrew scribes exiled in Babylon would have encountered the Babylonian flood traditions and incorporated them into their own theological framework. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed in the late 20th century, suggested that around 7,000 years ago the Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural dam at what is now the Bosporus Strait and poured into a lower freshwater lake, rapidly transforming it into the saltwater Black Sea and flooding thousands of square kilometres of inhabited land. If farming communities around the lake fled this rising water, they may have carried the memory with them in all directions, spreading a story of sudden catastrophic flooding. Critics of this hypothesis point out that the dating and scale of the event remain contested, and that even if it occurred, it would not explain flood stories from regions with no historical connection to the Black Sea. Another possibility is that the flood narratives preserve memories of the end of the last ice age, a period when global sea levels rose dramatically as massive ice sheets melted. Over several millennia, coastlines around the world were inundated, river valleys were drowned, and low-lying plains disappeared beneath the sea. People living on these coasts would have experienced a slow but relentless encroachment of the ocean, generation by generation, the sea claiming more land, until stories of lost lands and drowned worlds became part of the collective memory. These memories, compressed and dramatized over thousands of years of oral retelling, could have emerged as flood myths in cultures worldwide. Still others propose that the flood archetype arises independently in many cultures because flooding is a universal human experience. Rivers flood, coasts are battered by storms, lakes overflow, civilizations that depend on water for survival are also threatened by it. The psychological impact of a flood, the terror of rising water, the loss of home and stability, the isolation and helplessness, imprints itself on communities and is passed down through stories. Each culture, facing its own floods, creates its own narrative of a great deluge, a divine or natural catastrophe, and a heroic survival. The parallels are not evidence of a shared event, but of a shared human response to a shared type of disaster. Part 3. To understand why the flood story took hold so deeply in Mesopotamia, one must return to the daily realities of life in that land, where the rhythm of survival was dictated entirely by water. The people who settled in the alluvial plains did not choose an easy life. They chose a life of abundance interrupted by catastrophe, and they learned to live with both. The soil was rich beyond measure, renewed each year by the silt brought down from the mountains. A single good harvest could feed a family for a year and leave surplus enough to trade, but the same rivers that gave life could take it away with terrifying speed. Imagine a farmer in the early settlements, long before the age of kings, before the great cities rose. His name is lost to time, so we will simply think of him as a man among many, living in a cluster of reed houses on a low mound beside the Euphrates. He rises before dawn, as farmers have always risen, and steps outside into the cool air. The sky is still dark, but the eastern horizon is beginning to pale. He walks to the edge of the mound and looks out across his fields. The barley is nearly ready for harvest, the stalks heavy with grain, bending in the faint breeze. If the weather holds for another week, the harvest will be good. His family will eat well. There will be enough to trade for oil, for cloth, perhaps even a small ornament of polished shell for his wife. But as he stands there, he notices something. The sound of the river is different. Normally, at this time of year, the Euphrates runs swift and full, a steady rushing sound that has become so familiar he scarcely hears it. This morning the sound is louder, deeper, a low rumble that seems to vibrate in his chest. He walks closer down the slope of the mound, through the narrow paths between the reed fences that mark his neighbours' plots. When he reaches the riverbank, he stops. The water is higher than it was yesterday, not by much, but enough to notice. The current is faster, carrying branches and clumps of vegetation torn from upstream. The colour of the water has changed, from its usual muddy brown to a darker reddish hue, thick with silt. He feels a tightness in his stomach. He has seen this before, not often, but often enough. The river is rising. He does not know why. He does not know that far to the north, in the mountains he has never seen, an unusually heavy snowfall melted all at once under an early summer heat, sending a surge of water cascading down the tributaries and into the main channel. He does not know that other tributaries have swollen with rain and are pouring their excess into the same system. All he knows is that the river is rising, and if it continues to rise, his fields will flood. He turns and walks quickly back to his house. His wife is awake now, grinding barley in a stone quern, the rhythmic scraping sound familiar and comforting. He tells her what he has seen. She stops grinding and looks at him, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She knows what this means. They have a plan, as all families in this land have a plan. They have stored some grain in large jars sealed with clay stoppers and bitumen, kept inside the house on a raised platform of bricks. They have a small boat made of bundled reeds, tied up at the riverbank. If the water rises into the village, they will load the jars into the boat along with their most essential tools, their children, and whatever livestock they can manage, and they will move to higher ground. But higher ground is not abundant here. The land is flat for as far as anyone can walk in a day. The nearest hill is half a day's journey to the east, a barren rise of stone and scrub where nothing grows and no water flows. If they go there, they will be safe from the flood, but they will have no food, no way to sustain themselves. So they wait. They watch the river. They hope. By midday the water has risen further. It has crept over the lower fields and is lapping at the edges of the irrigation ditches. The farmer and his neighbours gather at the riverbank, speaking in low voices, pointing at the water, estimating how much time they have. Some argue for leaving immediately, others insist the river will crest soon and begin to fall, as it has in other years. The oldest man in the village, a man who has lived through more flood seasons than anyone else, shakes his head slowly and says nothing. His silence is more frightening than any words. By evening the decision is made for them. The water has risen onto the mound itself, swirling around the bases of the houses, seeping under the reed walls. The farmer and his wife load their boat. The jars of grain go in first, placed carefully so they will not tip. Then their daughter, a girl of perhaps 5 or 6, clutching a small clay doll. Then their son, an infant wrapped in cloth. The wife climbs in, settling herself among the jars, holding the children close. The farmer ties a rope to the boat and loops the other end around his waist. He does not get in. Instead, he wades into the rising water, pulling the boat behind him, heading east toward the distant hill. The water is waist deep now, and the current pulls at him, trying to knock him off his feet. The ground beneath him is uneven, treacherous with hidden ditches and the remnants of old walls. He moves slowly, testing each step using a long pole to probe ahead. Behind him, he can hear the voices of his neighbours doing the same, families scattered across the flooding plain, each pulling their boat towards safety, each alone in the growing darkness. The children cry, the women sing soft, repetitive songs to calm them. The men say nothing, saving their breath for the effort of walking against the current. By the time they reach the hill, it is full night. The water has followed them, rising almost as fast as they walked, and now it laps at the base of the hill, turning it into a temporary island. Other families are already there, huddled on the rocky slope, their boats pulled up beside them. There is no shelter here, no firewood, no fresh water except what they brought with them. They sit in the darkness, listening to the water, feeling the ground beneath them and hoping it will not be covered too. The children eventually fall asleep, exhausted. The adults stay awake, watching the horizon, waiting for the first light of dawn to show them how much of their world is left. The water stays high for days. At its peak, it covers everything they know. The fields are gone, drowned under a vast brown lake that stretches to the horizon in every direction. Their village is submerged. Only the very tops of the tallest houses are visible, dark shapes breaking the surface like the backs of sleeping animals. The farmer and his family survive on the grain they brought, rationing it carefully, drinking from the jars of water they filled before leaving. They wait. There is nothing else to do. When the water finally begins to recede, it does so slowly, reluctantly, as if it has claimed the land and does not wish to release it. First the hilltop expands, then the upper slopes, then the plain begins to reappear, dark and slick with mud. The farmer and his family return to the site of their village. The houses have collapsed, their walls softened by the water and unable to bear their own weight. The fields are buried under a thick layer of silt. The irrigation ditches are clogged. The small shrine where the village gathered to honour the local deity is gone, swept away entirely. Everything they built is either destroyed or damaged beyond recognition. They begin again. They dig the mud out of the foundations of their house. They gather reeds and weave new walls. They clear the fields, one basketful of silt at a time, spreading it thin so it will dry and become workable soil again. The work takes weeks, then months. By the time the next planting season arrives, they have rebuilt enough to survive. The harvest is smaller than it would have been, but it is enough. They survive. Their children grow. Life continues. But the memory of the flood does not fade. The farmer tells his children about the water that rose and covered the world. He tells them how they fled to the hill, how they waited in the darkness, how they returned to find everything gone. His children will tell their children, and those children will tell theirs. With each telling, the details will shift slightly. The flood will grow larger in memory, more complete, more absolute. The hill will become a mountain. The boat will become an ark. The family will become the last family, the only survivors of a world-ending deluge. The story will take on the weight of myth, but at its core, it will remain what it always was, a memory of water rising, of survival against the odds, of the loss and rebuilding. This is how traditions are born, not in grand singular events witnessed by all, but in the accumulation of small catastrophes, each one told and retold until the specific becomes the universal, until the local flood becomes the flood, the deluge, the end and the beginning. The people of Mesopotamia experienced such floods not once but many times across the millennia. Some floods were worse than others. Some were so severe that entire cities were abandoned, their inhabitants scattering to other regions, carrying their stories with them. Archaeologists have found evidence of massive flooding in the archaeological record of ancient Sumer, layers of water-laid sediment several feet thick, separating one occupation layer from another, marking moments when the land was drowned and life paused before resuming. In one such layer, excavated at the ancient city of Ur, the archaeologist Leonard Woolley in the early 20th century uncovered what he believed was evidence of the biblical flood itself. Beneath the ruins of the Sumerian city, beneath layers of pottery and brick and ash, he found a thick stratum of clean, water-deposited clay, empty of artifacts, sterile and uniform. Beneath that layer, he found more artifacts, older pottery, signs of earlier habitation. To Woolley, this seemed proof that a great flood had interrupted the continuity of human settlement, exactly as the ancient texts described. He announced his findings with excitement, believing he had located the historical basis for the flood of Noah and Gilgamesh. Later analysis complicated this interpretation. The clay layer at Ur was not found at other sites, or was found at different depths and different dates, suggesting that Ur's flood was a local event, one of many such events that struck different cities at different times. What Woolley had found was not the flood, but a flood, one catastrophic inundation among many. Yet this does not diminish the significance of the discovery. It confirms that the people of ancient Mesopotamia had every reason to tell stories of world-drowning deluges, because they lived through them, again and again, watching their world disappear beneath the water, and then laboriously rebuilding it when the water retreated. As the Sumerian cities grew and their political and religious institutions became more complex, the flood story was woven into the fabric of their cosmology. It became more than a memory of disaster. It became a theological statement about the relationship between gods and humans, about the fragility of civilization, about the need for piety and obedience and the consequences of hubris. The gods, in the Sumerian worldview, were not distant or abstract. They were immediate and involved, possessing emotions and desires and conflicts. They created humanity for a purpose, to serve them, to work the land and maintain the temples and provide offerings. But humanity was also capable of disappointing the gods, of becoming too numerous, too noisy, too independent. The flood in this framework was a reset, a moment when the gods exercised their ultimate power to unmake what they had made. But it was also a moment of mercy, because one god chose to preserve a remnant, to ensure that life would continue, that the experiment of humanity would have another chance. The figure of the flood survivor, whether called Ziusudra or Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, became a symbol of faithfulness, of the individual who listens to divine wisdom and acts on it, even when it seems irrational, even when his neighbours mock him for building a boat on dry land. He became the link between the old world and the new, the carrier of knowledge and life across the boundary of annihilation. This theological dimension helps explain why the flood story was so important to the scribes and priests of Mesopotamia. It was not just a story about weather or geology. It was a story about meaning, about the moral order of the universe, about why things fall apart and how they are put back together. It was a story to be told to children so they would understand the power of the gods and the importance of humility. It was a story to be recited in temples during festivals, reinforcing the community's shared identity and shared values. It was a story to be written down and preserved because it was a story that defined what it meant to be human in a world governed by forces beyond human control. The scribes who copied the flood texts in the temple schools of Uruk and Nippur were not merely recording history. They were participating in a sacred act of preservation. Each time they pressed their reed stylus into a fresh tablet of wet clay, forming the intricate wedge-shaped signs of cuneiform script, they were ensuring that the story would outlive them, that it would be available to future generations, that the memory would not be lost even if another flood came and destroyed the city. The tablets were stored in libraries, rooms stacked with shelves of clay, thousands upon thousands of texts covering every aspect of knowledge, hymns, prayers, legal codes, medical treatises, astronomical observations, mathematical tables, and stories, always stories, because stories were how people made sense of the world. The flood narrative was copied more frequently than many other texts, suggesting it held a special place in the curriculum and in the culture. Young scribes learning their craft would practice by copying portions of the epic. Experienced scribes would produce multiple versions for different temples and patrons. The story existed in many recensions, each slightly different, reflecting the individual scribe's memory or interpretation, or the particular tradition of his city. Some versions emphasized the role of one god over another. Some included details that others omitted. Some were fragmentary, broken tablets, with only a few lines preserved, while others were nearly complete. But all of them told the same essential story. The gods decided to destroy the world with water. One man was warned and built a boat. He survived with his family and the animals. The waters receded. He made an offering, and the gods promised it would not happen again. The turning point in the history of the flood story, the moment when it moved from regional legend to something that would echo across all of human civilization, came with the rise of the first true empires in Mesopotamia. These were not merely city-states controlling their immediate hinterlands, but vast political entities that reached across hundreds of miles, absorbing diverse peoples, languages, and traditions into a single administrative and cultural framework. The Akkadian Empire, established in the 24th century before the Common Era by Sargon of Akkad, was among the first. Sargon and his successors unified the Sumerian cities of the south with the Akkadian-speaking regions of the north, creating a realm that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. With political unification came cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. Stories that had been local, tied to specific cities and their patron deities, began to circulate more widely. Scribes in one city read and copied text from another. Merchants carried tablets along trade routes. Soldiers and administrators moved from region to region, bringing their traditions with them. The flood story, which had originated in the Sumerian cities of the south, was adopted by the Akkadians and translated into their Semitic language. In this process of translation and adaptation, the story was refined, expanded, and given new literary power. The Akkadian scribes were masters of their craft. They understood the rhythms of language, the power of repetition and variation, the emotional weight of well-chosen images. When they composed the Atrahasis epic, they were not merely translating an old Sumerian tale. They were creating a work of literature that would stand among the greatest achievements of ancient writing. The epic opened with the creation of humanity, describing how the gods had grown weary of their labours and decided to create humans to do the work for them. The lesser gods, the Agigi, had been digging the channels of the rivers and maintaining the earth, and they rebelled, throwing down their tools and threatening the order of the cosmos. To resolve the crisis, the god Enki proposed the creation of a new being, fashioned from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, a being that would carry the burden of labour so the gods could rest. Humanity was made and humanity multiplied, spreading across the earth, cultivating the fields, building cities, filling the world with noise and activity. But this very success became a problem. The text describes how the clamour of humanity rose up to heaven and disturbed the sleep of the gods. The god Enlil, chief of the divine council, could not rest. He grew irritable, then angry, and finally he proposed a solution. Let humanity be reduced. Let plague come upon them and thin their numbers. The plague came, and many died, but the survivors prayed to Enki, who taught them how to appease the gods and end the pestilence. The population recovered and grew again. Enlil tried again, sending drought. The rains ceased, the rivers shrank, the crops failed. Famine spread across the land. People starved, and the texts do not shy away from the horror of it, describing mothers eating their children, the desperate measures of a world without food. Again, the survivors turned to Enki, and again he provided a way to restore balance. The rains returned, the population recovered. Enlil's frustration deepened. He proposed a third solution, a final solution, one that could not be undone or mitigated, a flood that would destroy all life, wiping the slate clean so the gods could finally have peace. The divine council agreed, and they swore an oath not to warn humanity. But Enki, who had made humanity, and who felt kinship with them, could not bear to see them utterly destroyed. Bound by his oath not to speak directly to any human, he found a way around the restriction. He went to the house of Atrahasis, the wise man, and spoke to the wall of the reed hut, addressing the wall rather than the man inside. The wall, he said, should know that a great flood is coming, that a boat should be built, that life should be preserved. Atrahasis, listening from inside, understood. He questioned the voice, asking how he should explain to his neighbours why he was building such a vessel. Enki instructed him to tell them he was leaving, going away to live in the realm of the waters, and that he was building a boat for that journey. The neighbours, hearing this, would think him eccentric but harmless, and they would leave him to his work. Atrahasis built the boat according to Enki's instructions. The text provides details. The boat was to be roofed over, sealed with bitumen inside and out, strong enough to withstand the pressures of the flood. He was to bring his family, and also skilled craftsmen, so that knowledge would survive, so that the arts of civilization would not be lost. He was to bring animals, birds, and wild beasts, ensuring that the diversity of life would continue. When the boat was finished and loaded, Atrahasis entered with his family and sealed the door. The sky darkened. The storm began. The description of the flood in the Atrahasis epic is one of the most powerful passages in all of ancient literature. The storm god Adad rode across the heavens, his voice the thunder. Lightning split the sky. The dams of heaven were torn open and water poured down. Simultaneously, the springs of the deep burst forth, the subterranean waters rising from below. The world was caught between two walls of water, above and below, crushed in a vice of elemental force. The text describes the terror of the gods themselves, who had unleashed something they could not control. They retreated to the highest heaven and cowered there, watching the destruction they had decreed, beginning to regret their decision even as it unfolded. For 7 days and 7 nights the storm raged. The waters covered the earth, everything that breathed air perished. The cities were drowned, the fields obliterated, the mountains submerged. On the 8th day, the storm ceased. Silence fell over the drowned world. Atrahasis opened a window in the boat and looked out. There was nothing to see but water stretching to the horizon in every direction, flat and still under a clearing sky. He wept, the text says, for the loss of the world, for all the people who had drowned, for the magnitude of the destruction. Slowly the waters began to recede. The boat drifted until it came to rest on a mountain, though the text does not specify which one. Atrahasis waited, then sent out birds to test whether the land had reappeared. The first bird, possibly a dove, flew out and found no place to land, so it returned. He waited, then sent another bird, which also returned. Finally he sent a raven, and the raven did not return, for it had found land and carrion to feed upon. Atrahasis knew then that the earth was dry enough to support life. He opened the boat and released the animals. He built an altar from stones gathered on the mountainside, and made an offering to the gods, burning incense and the fat of animals, sending the smoke up into the sky. The gods, who had been without offering since the flood began, smelled the sweet savour and gathered above the altar like flies, as the text vividly puts it, drawn by the aroma, desperate for the worship and sustenance that only humanity could provide. They realised in that moment what they had nearly lost. Humanity was not merely a source of annoyance, humanity was necessary. Without humans to maintain the temples, to perform the rituals, to offer sacrifices, the gods themselves would diminish. The goddess Ninhursag, the mother goddess, looked upon the scene and swore an oath. She took off her necklace of lapis lazuli, the precious blue stone that symbolised the heavens, and held it up, declaring that she would never forget this day, that the necklace would be a reminder, a pledge that such destruction would never be decreed again. But Enlil, arriving at the gathering, was initially furious. How had any human survived? Who had broken the oath of silence? He looked around at the assembled gods, and his gaze fell on Enki. Enki, ever clever, did not deny his role but reframed the issue. He argued that destroying all of humanity for the noise of a few was unjust. If some humans deserved punishment, let them be punished individually. If the population needed to be controlled, let there be natural limits: disease, wild animals, infertility, barrenness. Let these things regulate the human population without resorting to total annihilation. The other gods saw the wisdom in this. Enlil, though still angry, accepted the argument. He blessed Atrahasis and his wife, granting them a place among the gods, or in some versions, a special status as the progenitors of the new human race. This version of the story, preserved in the Atrahasis epic, circulated throughout Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years. It was read and reread, copied and recopied, studied by scholars and recited by priests. When the Babylonians rose to power in the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, they inherited the story and incorporated it into their own literary tradition. The city of Babylon became the greatest city in Mesopotamia, a center of learning, religion, and political power. Its patron god, Marduk, was elevated above all other gods, and Babylonian theologians rewrote older myths to place Marduk at the center. The creation epic, the Enuma Elish, was composed to glorify Marduk as the champion who defeated chaos and brought order to the cosmos. But the flood story remained largely intact because it served purposes that transcended the politics of divine hierarchy. The Babylonians also produced the version of the flood story that would become most famous in the ancient world, the version embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was a legendary king of the city of Uruk, a figure who may have been based on a real ruler, but who became, in the epic, a symbol of the human struggle against mortality. The epic tells of his adventures, his friendship with the wild man Enkidu, his grief at Enkidu's death, and his desperate quest to find the secret of eternal life. This quest leads him to the ends of the earth, across deadly waters, to the home of Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the one human who had been granted immortality by the gods. Gilgamesh arrives exhausted and asks Utnapishtim how he achieved what no other mortal had achieved. Utnapishtim responds by telling the story of the flood. He describes how the gods decided to destroy humanity, how Ea, the Babylonian name for Enki, warned him by speaking to the wall of his reed house, how he built the boat and brought aboard his family, his possessions, craftsmen and animals. He describes the storm in language that echoes the Atrahasis epic, but with even greater intensity. The storm is so violent that even the gods are terrified. They flee to the highest heaven and press themselves against the outer wall, crouching like dogs, trembling at the power of the forces they have unleashed. The flood lasts 6 days and 7 nights. On the 7th day, the storm subsides. Utnapishtim opens a window and looks out over the silent, drowned world. He describes how he wept at the sight, how all of humanity had been turned to clay, how the surface of the sea was flat as a rooftop. The boat comes to rest on Mount Nimush, and Utnapishtim waits 7 more days before sending out the birds, a dove, a swallow, and a raven, each with the same result as in the earlier versions. When the raven does not return, Utnapishtim releases all the animals and makes his offering. The gods gather, and Enlil, seeing that a human has survived, is angry until Ea rebukes him, arguing that it was unjust to destroy the righteous along with the wicked. Enlil relents and grants Utnapishtim and his wife immortality, but with a condition. They must live far from other humans, at the edge of the world, in a place where no mortal can reach them. Gilgamesh listens to this story, and realizes the futility of his quest. Utnapishtim's immortality was a unique gift, granted under unique circumstances that will never be repeated. There is no path for Gilgamesh to follow, no ritual or secret that will allow him to escape death. The gods have decreed that humans are mortal, and that decree is final. Utnapishtim offers Gilgamesh a challenge. If he wishes to live forever, let him first try to stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights, for sleep is the younger brother of death. Gilgamesh accepts the challenge, but almost immediately he falls asleep, exhausted from his journey. He sleeps for 7 days, and each day Utnapishtim's wife bakes a loaf of bread and places it beside him as proof of how long he has slept. When Gilgamesh finally wakes, he sees the loaves in various stages of decay and realizes he has failed. He despairs, but Utnapishtim takes pity on him and tells him of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that can restore youth, if not grant immortality. Gilgamesh dives down, retrieves the plant and begins his journey home, hoping to share it with the elders of Uruk. But on the way, while he bathes in a pool, a serpent smells the plant and steals it, shedding its skin and becoming young again as it slithers away. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, having learned that mortality is inescapable, but also that immortality of a different kind is possible through the works one leaves behind, the city one builds, the stories one inspires. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its embedded flood narrative, became one of the most widely distributed texts of the ancient Near East. It was copied in multiple languages: Akkadian, Hittite, Hurrian. Fragments have been found in sites from Anatolia to the Levant to Mesopotamia itself. The story of Gilgamesh and the story of the flood became inseparable, each giving meaning to the other. The flood story provided the theological backdrop, the reminder of human fragility and divine power. The Gilgamesh frame gave the flood story a new emotional resonance, connecting it to the universal human experience of grief, loss, and the search for meaning in the face of death. At the height of Mesopotamian civilization, in the centuries when Babylon and later Assyria dominated the known world, the flood story had become more than a religious text or a piece of ancient literature. It had woven itself into the fabric of daily life, into the way people understood their place in the cosmos, into the rituals that marked the turning of the seasons and the rhythms of the agricultural year. To live in one of the great cities of Mesopotamia during this period was to inhabit a world saturated with stories, where every street corner had its shrine, every month its festival, every natural phenomenon its divine explanation. Consider the city of Babylon in the time of Hammurabi, in the 18th century before the Common Era, or later during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century. Babylon was a city of perhaps 100,000 people, perhaps more, depending on the season and the fortunes of the empire. It was built on both banks of the Euphrates, connected by a bridge, surrounded by massive walls of baked brick that stretched for miles. The streets were narrow and winding, lined with houses built of mud brick, their walls whitewashed or left the natural pale brown of dried clay. The houses turned inward, built around central courtyards where families cooked, ate, and spent their evenings. The courtyards were shaded by awnings of woven reed or cloth, and in the centre of many stood a small altar or niche where household gods received daily offerings of bread, beer, and incense. In the morning, the city came alive with the sounds of commerce and labour. Bakers fired their ovens, filling the air with the smell of baking bread. Brewers stirred their vats of fermenting barley, the sweet yeasty aroma mixing with the smoke of cooking fires. Potters shaped clay on their wheels, their hands wet and practiced, forming jars and bowls and lamps that would be sold in the market. Weavers sat at their looms, the rhythmic clack of the heddles and the soft thump of the beater, creating a percussive music that drifted through open windows. Metalworkers hammered copper and bronze, their forges glowing red, the ringing of metal on metal punctuating the general hum of the city. The market was the heart of daily life, a sprawling open area near the centre of the city where merchants set up stalls under awnings of reed matting. Here, one could buy almost anything: grain and oil, vegetables and fruit, fish brought up from the marshes in the south, mutton and goat meat, pottery and baskets, cloth and garments, tools and jewellery, incense and perfumes, amulets and charms. The merchants called out to passers-by, praising the quality of their goods, negotiating prices in rapid exchanges that mixed flattery, exaggeration, and genuine haggling. Scribes sat at small tables, reed styluses in hand, ready to write contracts or receipts for a small fee. Money in the modern sense did not yet exist. Transactions were conducted in barley, silver weighed on scales, or barter, one good exchange for another according to customary rates that everyone understood. Beyond the market, the city's temples rose on their high platforms, the ziggurats that dominated the skyline. The greatest of these was the Asagala, the Temple of Marduk, a massive complex of courtyards, chapels, storerooms, and the ziggurat itself, a stepped tower of baked brick that climbed toward the sky in diminishing tiers. The ziggurat was not a place of public worship, but a symbolic mountain, a meeting place between earth and heaven, a stairway for the gods. At its summit was a small shrine where, it was believed, Marduk descended to rest when he visited the city. The priests climbed the stairs each day to tend the shrine, to ensure it was clean and supplied with offerings, though no human was permitted to sleep there, for that space belonged to the god alone. The temple complex employed hundreds of people: priests and priestesses, scribes and accountants, bakers and brewers, musicians and singers, gatekeepers and cleaners. The temple owned vast tracts of land, worked by tenant farmers who gave a portion of their harvest to the temple in exchange for the right to farm. The temple stored the grain in great granaries and redistributed it as rations to its workers, as offerings to the god, and as loans to farmers and merchants. In this way, the temple functioned as both a religious institution and an economic engine, a bank and a welfare system, a centre of knowledge and a preserver of tradition. Among the temple's most important roles was the preservation of texts. The libraries attached to the major temples held thousands of clay tablets covering every field of knowledge. There were administrative records tracking the movement of goods and labour. There were legal texts, collections of laws and court decisions. There were medical texts, lists of symptoms and treatments. There were mathematical texts, tables of multiplication and division, solutions to geometric problems. There were astronomical texts, recording the movements of the stars and planets, predicting eclipses and conjunctions. And there were literary texts, the myths and epics and hymns that told the stories of the gods and heroes, including the flood story in its many versions. A scribe working in one of these libraries lived a life of privilege and responsibility. He had been trained from childhood, entering the scribal school as a young boy, and spending years learning to read and write the hundreds of cuneiform signs, mastering the intricacies of Sumerian and Akkadian grammar, memorizing the classic texts that formed the core of the curriculum. His hands were trained to hold the reed stylus at the correct angle, to press it into the clay with the right amount of force to form each sign cleanly and precisely. His eyes were trained to read the tiny wedges on old, worn tablets, to recognize the hand of different scribes, to spot errors and corruptions in the text. When a tablet was damaged or wearing out, it was the scribe's job to copy it onto a fresh tablet, preserving the text for future generations. This was sacred work, for the knowledge contained in the tablets was the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the collective memory of the civilization. A scribe who copied the flood story was not merely reproducing words, he was participating in an act of cultural continuity, ensuring that the memory of the deluge and the salvation of Utnapishtim would survive, that the lessons embedded in the story would remain available to those who came after. The flood story was recited publicly during certain festivals, particularly those associated with the New Year. The Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu, was the most important religious event of the year, a 12-day celebration that reenacted the creation of the world and reaffirmed the king's divine mandate to rule. During the festival, priests recited the Enuma Elish, the creation epic, in the Temple of Marduk. The flood story, though not always formally part of the Akitu liturgy, was closely associated with the themes of destruction and renewal that the festival celebrated. The world had been destroyed and remade by water. The world was destroyed and remade each year by the cycle of the seasons. The king, as Marduk's representative on earth, was symbolically destroyed and remade by the ritual humiliation and reinstatement that formed part of the festival. For the ordinary people of Babylon, the flood story was not an abstract theological concept. It was a lived reality, a memory embedded in the landscape and the calendar. Every spring the rivers rose. Every spring there was the possibility that the water would rise too high, that the fields would be drowned, that the city would be threatened. The people watched the water levels with the same anxious attention their ancestors had watched them 1,000 years before. They repaired the dikes and canals, reinforced the levees, and prayed to the gods to moderate the flood. When the waters receded and the fields emerged green and fertile, they gave thanks, offering the first fruits of the harvest to the temples, acknowledging that their survival depended on forces beyond their control. Children growing up in Babylon heard the flood story from their parents and grandparents, learned it in school if they were fortunate enough to receive an education, heard it recited in the temples during festivals. The story taught them several things. It taught them that the gods were powerful and capricious, capable of great destruction, but also capable of mercy. It taught them that humanity's existence was contingent, that it could be ended at any moment if the gods willed it. It taught them the importance of obedience and piety, for Utnapishtim had been saved because he listened to the god Ea and followed instructions precisely. It taught them the value of wisdom and foresight, for Utnapishtim had prepared for disaster when everyone around him saw no danger. And it taught them that survival was not individual but communal, that Utnapishtim had saved not only himself but his family, the craftsmen, the animals, the seeds of all living things, ensuring the continuity of life itself. The story also served a psychological function, helping people process their fear of floods and other natural disasters. By framing the flood as a divine act with a moral purpose, the story made the disaster comprehensible. It was not random, it was not meaningless, it was a response to human behavior, a punishment for wickedness or noise or disobedience. This framework, while harsh, was also oddly comforting because it implied that humans had some measure of control. If disasters were punishments, then right behavior could prevent them. If one god could send a flood, another god could prevent it. The people were not helpless victims of blind natural forces. They were participants in a cosmic drama, and their actions mattered. In the homes of ordinary families, far from the grand temples and royal palaces, the flood story was passed down in simpler, more personal forms. A mother, putting her children to bed on a hot summer night, might tell them the story of the man who built a boat when everyone thought he was foolish, and how he was proven right when the rains came. A grandfather, sitting in the courtyard as the sun set and the evening cooled, might tell his grandchildren about the great flood that came before the world they knew, and how their ancestors survived it, and how they must always be ready, always watchful, because the water could rise again. These were not the elaborate literary versions preserved on tablets. They were oral traditions, flexible and personal, adapted to the needs of the moment, shaped by the teller's memory and imagination. The flood story also shaped practical behaviour. The architecture of Mesopotamian cities reflected a deep awareness of the threat of flooding. Houses were built on raised platforms. Important buildings, especially temples, were built on high artificial mounds constructed over centuries. Grain was stored in sealed jars on elevated shelves. Valuables were kept in chests that could be moved quickly. Families maintained boats, even families who did not fish or trade by water, because a boat was essential insurance against the rising river. These practices were passed down from generation to generation, embedded in the culture so deeply that people might not even consciously connect them to the flood story, yet the connection was there, a thread linking myth and daily life. Seasonal rituals reinforced the connection between story and survival. Before the flood season each year, communities would gather at local shrines to offer prayers and sacrifices, asking the gods to hold back the waters or send them gently. After the flood season, when the waters had receded and the planting could begin, there were festivals of thanksgiving, celebrations of survival and renewal. These rituals created a rhythm, a predictable pattern that gave shape to the year and reassured people that they were not alone in facing the dangers of the world. The gods were watching. The community was united. The ancient wisdom preserved in the stories would guide them through. The priesthood played a crucial role in maintaining this connection between myth and practice. Priests were not only religious figures but also keepers of knowledge, advisors to kings, interpreters of omens, and managers of the temple economy. They studied the old texts, including the flood narratives, and they taught their meanings to the next generation of priests. They also watched the natural world closely, recording observations of the weather, the rivers, the stars, looking for patterns that might help predict floods or droughts. Over centuries, this accumulated knowledge became a form of early science, a systematic attempt to understand and anticipate the behaviour of the natural world. Some priests specialised in divination, the art of reading omens and signs. They examined the livers of sacrificed animals, looking for irregularities that might indicate the gods' intentions. They watched the flights of birds, the movements of clouds, the colour of the moon. They interpreted dreams, both their own and those reported by others. When a king or a wealthy merchant wanted to know whether it was safe to undertake a journey, to launch a military campaign, to build a new house, they consulted a diviner. The diviner would perform the necessary rituals, examine the signs, and give his interpretation, which was often couched in ambiguous language that allowed for multiple outcomes but provided a framework for decision-making. The flood story was sometimes invoked in these divinatory contexts. If the sign suggested danger from water, the diviner might reference the story of Utnapishtim, reminding the client of the need for preparation and obedience to divine warnings. If the signs were favourable, the diviner might speak of the rainbow, the sign of the god's promise never to flood the world again, interpreting this as a reassurance that the current enterprise would be blessed. In this way, the ancient story remained alive and relevant, not a relic of the past, but a living tradition that spoke to present concerns. The flood story did not remain confined to Mesopotamia. As empires expanded and trade routes stretched across mountains and deserts, connecting distant lands and diverse peoples, the narratives and ideas of one culture inevitably encountered those of another. Merchants travelled from Babylon to the cities of the Levant, carrying not only goods but also stories. Diplomats and scribes moved between royal courts, exchanging letters written on clay tablets, negotiating treaties, arranging marriages. Soldiers marched across borders, conquering new territories and bringing with them the gods and myths of their homelands. In all these movements, the flood story travelled, and as it travelled, it changed, adapting to new landscapes, new languages, new theological frameworks. The Hittites, an Indo-European people who established a powerful empire in Anatolia during the second millennium before the Common Era, encountered Mesopotamian literature through their interactions with the Hurrians and Babylonians. The Hittite scribes, trained in the cuneiform script they had borrowed from Mesopotamia, copied and translated many Babylonian texts into their own language. Among these was a version of the Gilgamesh epic, including the flood narrative. The Hittite version follows the Babylonian original closely, but the very fact of its translation demonstrates how widely the story had spread. It was no longer merely a Sumerian or Babylonian tale, it had become part of the shared literary heritage of the ancient Near East. To the west, along the Mediterranean coast, the cities of the Levant flourished as centres of trade and cultural exchange. The Phoenicians, master sailors and merchants travelled throughout the Mediterranean, establishing colonies as far west as Spain and North Africa. The Canaanites, their close relatives, inhabited the coastal plains and interior valleys of what is now Israel, Lebanon and Syria. These peoples had their own rich mythological traditions, but they were also deeply influenced by Mesopotamian culture. Ugarit, a cosmopolitan city on the Syrian coast, has yielded tablets inscribed in a unique alphabetic script, recording myths and epics that show clear Mesopotamian influence alongside native Canaanite elements. While no direct flood narrative has been found in the Ugaritic texts, the broader mythological themes of divine conflict, cosmic order, and the relationship between gods and humanity echo the concerns of Mesopotamian literature. It was among the Hebrew people, however, that the Mesopotamian flood story found its most enduring transformation. The Hebrews, a Semitic people whose early history is intertwined with the cultures of Mesopotamia and Canaan, developed a religious tradition that was both influenced by and distinct from its neighbours. The Hebrew scriptures, compiled over many centuries from diverse oral and written sources, contain a flood narrative that is unmistakably related to the Babylonian versions, yet reshaped according to the distinctive theology of Israelite monotheism. The biblical flood story found in the book of Genesis tells of a world filled with violence and corruption. God, looking upon the earth, saw that humanity had become thoroughly wicked, and he regretted having made them. He decided to blot out all life from the face of the earth. But one man, Noah, was righteous and blameless in his generation, a man who walked with God. God revealed his plan to Noah and instructed him to build an ark of gopher wood, giving precise measurements. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, with 3 decks, a door in the side, and a roof. Noah was to bring into the ark his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, and pairs of every living creature, male and female, and food for them all. Noah did as God commanded, building the ark over many years while the world around him continued in its wickedness, oblivious to the coming disaster. When the ark was finished and all had been brought aboard, God himself shut the door, sealing Noah and his family inside. Then the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters rose and lifted the ark, and it floated above the drowned world. Everything that breathed air and lived on dry land perished. Only Noah and those with him in the ark survived. The waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days before God remembered Noah and sent a wind to pass over the waters, causing them to subside. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah waited, then opened the window and sent out a raven, which flew back and forth until the waters dried up. He sent out a dove, which found no place to rest and returned. After 7 days he sent the dove out again, and it returned in the evening with a freshly plucked olive leaf, showing that the waters had receded enough for trees to emerge. He waited another 7 days and sent the dove out once more, and this time it did not return. Noah removed the covering of the ark and saw that the ground was dry. God told him to come out, to release all the animals and to be fruitful and multiply. Noah built an altar and offered burnt offerings from every clean animal and bird. God smelled the pleasing aroma and made a covenant, promising never again to curse the ground because of humanity, or to destroy all living creatures as he had done. He set the rainbow in the clouds as a sign of this covenant, a reminder for all generations that the waters would never again become a flood to destroy the earth. God blessed Noah and his sons and gave them dominion over the animals, permitting them to eat meat but forbidding them to consume blood, for the life was in the blood. He also established a principle of justice. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed, for humans are made in the image of God. The parallels with the Mesopotamian versions are striking and numerous. Both involve a divine decision to destroy humanity because of their faults. Both include a single righteous man who receives advance warning from a deity. Both describe the construction of a large boat to specific dimensions. Both include the gathering of family and animals. Both describe a catastrophic flood from rain and subterranean waters. Both involve the boat coming to rest on a mountain. Both include the sending out of birds to test for dry land. Both conclude with an offering that pleases the deity and a divine promise regarding future floods. These parallels are too detailed and too consistent to be coincidental. They point to a common tradition, a shared story that was told in different ways by different peoples, yet the differences are equally significant. The Mesopotamian flood is sent by multiple gods, often for petty reasons such as noise or overpopulation, and one god acts against the consensus to save humanity. The biblical flood is sent by a single god in response to genuine moral corruption, and the same God who sends the flood also provides the means of salvation. The Mesopotamian hero is saved because of the favoritism of one god, and is granted immortality as a unique reward. The biblical Noah is saved because of his righteousness, and is commanded to repopulate the earth, remaining mortal and eventually dying like all humans. The Mesopotamian account emphasizes the capriciousness and fallibility of the gods, who regret their decision and cower in fear of the flood they unleashed. The biblical account emphasizes the sovereignty and justice of God, who acts with purpose and remains in control throughout. These differences reflect the theological revolution that Hebrew monotheism represented in the ancient world. For the Hebrews, there was only one God, the creator of heaven and earth, the source of all moral law, whose will was not arbitrary but grounded in justice and righteousness. The flood was not a divine tantrum but a moral reckoning, a necessary cleansing of a world that had become irredeemably corrupt. Yet even in judgment, God's mercy was evident, for he preserved a remnant and made a covenant ensuring that such total destruction would never happen again. The rainbow, a natural phenomenon that must have been familiar to people long before the flood story was written, was given new meaning as a sign of divine promise, a visible reminder of God's commitment to sustain the created order despite human sinfulness. The question of how the Hebrew flood story came to resemble the Babylonian version so closely has been debated for over a century. When archaeologists first deciphered the Mesopotamian flood tablets in the late 19th century, many biblical scholars were shocked by the similarities. Some saw this as evidence that the biblical account was merely a borrowed myth, no more historically reliable than any other ancient legend. Others argued that both accounts preserved a memory of a real historical event, the details of which had been passed down through separate traditions and shaped by different theological perspectives. Still others proposed that the Hebrews encountered the Babylonian flood story during the period of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century before the Common Era, when many Judeans were deported to Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem, and that Hebrew scribes adapted the story to fit their own monotheistic worldview. The exile hypothesis remains the most widely accepted scholarly explanation. During their time in Babylon, the exiled Judeans would have been exposed to Babylonian culture, literature, and religion. They would have seen the great temples and ziggurats, heard the recitation of the old myths, perhaps even had access to the libraries where the flood texts were kept. The scribes among the exiles, seeking to preserve and make sense of their own traditions in a foreign land, may have recognized the flood story as a narrative that could powerfully express their understanding of God's relationship with humanity. They took the basic structure of the Babylonian tale and reshaped it completely, transforming a polytheistic myth about divine caprice into a monotheistic parable about divine justice and mercy. Yet the influence may have been older and more complex than a simple borrowing during the exile. The Hebrews traced their ancestry back to Mesopotamia, to Abraham, who came from Ur of the Chaldeans, a city in southern Mesopotamia. If the patriarchal narratives preserve any historical memory, then the Hebrews' ancestors would have brought with them traditions and stories from Mesopotamia when they migrated westward. The flood story might have been part of this cultural inheritance, told and retold over centuries, gradually transformed as Hebrew religious identity developed and diverged from its Mesopotamian roots. In this view, the similarities between the Hebrew and Babylonian versions reflect not borrowing but shared ancestry, a common root from which both traditions grew. Regardless of the precise mechanism of transmission, the result was a flood narrative that became central to Hebrew and later Jewish and Christian theology. The story of Noah became a symbol of divine judgment and salvation, a reminder of the consequences of sin and the possibility of redemption. It was referenced by prophets, who warned that Israel's disobedience might bring a disaster comparable to the flood. It was invoked in prayers and liturgies, particularly those associated with rain and the agricultural cycle. It became part of the foundational narrative of the covenant between God and Israel, one of several covenants that structured the relationship between the divine and the human in Hebrew thought. The story also travelled beyond the strictly religious sphere into popular culture and folklore. The image of Noah's Ark, a vessel of salvation carrying a remnant of life through catastrophic destruction, became a powerful and enduring symbol. Artists depicted it in mosaics, frescoes, and illuminated manuscripts. Storytellers elaborated on details not provided in the biblical text: what life was like inside the ark, how Noah managed the animals, what happened immediately after the flood. These elaborations created a rich tradition of interpretation and imagination that kept the story alive and relevant across changing historical circumstances. While the Hebrew version was taking shape in the West, other cultures around the ancient world were developing their own flood narratives, either independently or through contact with Mesopotamian traditions. The ancient Greeks, whose civilization flourished on the rocky islands and peninsulas of the Aegean Sea, far from the great river valleys of Mesopotamia, told their own flood story centered on the figure of Deucalion. According to the myth, Zeus, the king of the gods, grew disgusted with the violence and impiety of the Bronze Age humans. He decided to destroy them with a flood. Prometheus, the titan who had created humanity, and who foresaw the coming disaster, warned his son Deucalion. Deucalion built a chest, a wooden box or small boat, and took refuge in it with his wife Pyrrha. Zeus unleashed the flood, and for 9 days and 9 nights the rain fell, covering the earth and drowning all but Deucalion and Pyrrha. When the waters receded, the chest came to rest on Mount Parnassus, one of the sacred mountains of Greece. Deucalion and Pyrrha emerged and made an offering to Zeus. The god, pleased by their piety, sent the messenger god Hermes to offer them a wish. They wished for humanity to be restored. Hermes instructed them to walk away from the altar and throw the bones of their mother over their shoulders without looking back. Deucalion understood that their mother was Gaia, the earth, and that her bones were the stones of the ground. He and Pyrrha picked up stones and threw them behind them as they walked. The stones thrown by Deucalion became men, and those thrown by Pyrrha became women. Thus humanity was recreated, and from Deucalion and Pyrrha descended the Greeks. The Greek flood story shares the basic structure of the Mesopotamian versions, but with distinctly Greek characteristics. The gods are depicted as anthropomorphic beings with human emotions and appetites, capable of anger and capriciousness but also of being moved by piety and suffering. The hero, Deucalion, is saved not because of a conspiracy among the gods, but because of his piety and his father's foresight. The repopulation of the earth through the throwing of stones is a uniquely Greek touch, imaginative and somewhat whimsical, quite unlike the more straightforward reproduction of the Mesopotamian and Hebrew versions. The flood does not result in a fundamental change in the relationship between gods and humans, nor does it bring a covenant or promise. Rather, it is presented as one episode in the long history of human civilization, a reset that allows for a new golden age before the inevitable return to the violence and impiety that characterized the later ages. The Greek flood story was less concerned with morality and divine justice than with the cyclical nature of history, the idea that civilizations arose and fell in an eternal rhythm. This reflected the Greek philosophical tradition, which sought to understand the underlying principles governing the cosmos, rather than to interpret events as expressions of divine will. Yet the flood story remained important in Greek culture, symbolizing the possibility of renewal and the restoration of what had been lost. It was referenced in literature, drama, and philosophical discussions. It influenced later Greek and Roman writers who adapted and elaborated on the myth. In India, the ancient texts known as the Puranas contain a flood narrative that centers on Manu, the first man, and a small fish that reveals itself as an avatar of Vishnu. The story tells of Manu performing a ritual bathing in a river when a small fish swims into his hands. The fish speaks to him, asking Manu to save it from the larger fish that prey upon it. Manu brings the fish to a jar, but it quickly outgrows the jar and asks to be transferred to a larger container. It outgrows each successive container until finally Manu carries it to the ocean, where it can swim freely. The fish then reveals itself as Vishnu and warns Manu of a coming flood. The god instructs Manu to gather all the seeds of plants, all the pairs of animals and the 7 sages, and to build a large boat. When the flood comes, it covers the earth and overwhelms all the mountains. Manu's boat floats on the endless ocean. The great fish reappears, and Manu ties a rope from the boat to the fish's horn, and the fish pulls the boat through the deluge. Eventually the waters recede and the boat comes to rest on a peak. Manu releases the animals and plants and begins to repopulate the earth. The 7 sages, who have ridden out the flood in the boat with Manu, help him establish the various aspects of civilization: law, ritual, the division of society into castes, and the sciences. The Indian flood narrative differs from the Mesopotamian and Hebrew versions in several important ways. First, the flood is not presented as a punishment for human wickedness, but rather as a periodic occurrence, a natural feature of cosmic cycles. The universe is understood in Hindu philosophy as subject to eternal cycles of creation and destruction, expansion and contraction. Floods are simply part of this cosmic rhythm, not extraordinary events requiring explanation but expected recurrences. Second, the role of the divine is more abstract and philosophical. Vishnu is not an arbitrary god prone to anger, but a cosmic principle, a maintainer of the universe who ensures that life survives each catastrophe so that the cycle can continue. Third, the focus is not on moral accountability, but on the preservation of knowledge and order. The 7 sages represent the continuity of civilization, the transmission of wisdom from one age to the next. The Indian version also incorporates the theme of the fish, which has no parallel in the Mesopotamian or Hebrew narratives. This may reflect independent development, or it may reflect contact with cultures for which fishing and water were central concerns. The fish's saviour figure has deep roots in Indian mythology, and may represent the transformation of nature into divine wisdom, the recognition that guidance can come from unexpected sources. The story emphasizes virtues such as compassion, Manu's willingness to save the fish, and obedience to divine instruction, values central to Hindu ethics. In China, the flood story appears in a different form still. The legendary Emperor Yao ruled during a time when the world was threatened by catastrophic flooding. Waters rose to cover the hills and mountains, flooding the land and threatening civilization. The people suffered greatly, and Emperor Yao appointed Gun to control the flood. Gun worked for 9 years but failed, using the wrong methods. He attempted to dam the waters, building barriers to contain them, but the dams ultimately failed and the flooding continued. Yao executed Gun for his failure, but Gun's son, Yu, inherited the task. Yu took a different approach. Rather than trying to contain the water, he dredged channels and dikes, guiding the water back to its proper courses. He worked with the natural flow of water rather than against it, understanding that containment would ultimately fail, but that channeling could succeed. Yu laboured for 13 years, never returning home, sleeping at his post, entirely dedicated to the task. His efforts were rewarded with success. The waters were controlled, the earth became habitable again, and civilization could flourish. Because of his achievement, Yu was chosen as Yao's successor and became the founder of the Xia dynasty, China's first dynastic state. The Chinese flood narrative is distinctive in several respects. First, it emphasizes human agency and ingenuity over divine intervention. The gods do not send the flood in the Chinese account. It arises from natural causes, the overflow of waters that exceeds normal limits. The solution comes not from receiving divine instruction or from being preserved in a vessel, but from understanding the principles of water management and applying them through hard work and perseverance. Second, the story celebrates the virtue of diligence and sacrifice. Yu's willingness to work ceaselessly, to forgo personal comfort and family relationships in pursuit of the greater good, becomes a model for later rulers and statesmen. Third, the narrative is explicitly connected to dynastic politics. The flood is not merely a natural event, but a test through which the fitness of rulers is demonstrated. gun fails and loses the mandate of heaven, Yu succeeds and gains it, establishing his right to rule and to found a dynasty. The Chinese flood story thus transforms the basic motif of catastrophic inundation and human survival into a narrative about governance and virtue, about the qualities that make a ruler worthy of heaven's mandate. It remains rooted in the concern with water that characterized the great river civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, but it emphasizes different values and draws different lessons from the experience of flooding. In Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile was so central to life that it was incorporated into the very theology and cosmology of Egyptian civilization. The flooding was not viewed as a disaster to be survived, but as a blessing, a necessary and expected part of the natural cycle. The god Hapi was the personification of the inundation, and the flooding itself was a time of celebration and religious significance. The Egyptians did not develop a flood myth comparable to those of Mesopotamia, Greece, or India, because their relationship with flooding was fundamentally different. The Nile's flooding was predictable, regular, and life-giving rather than chaotic and destructive. Yet Egypt was not untouched by the flood narratives of neighbouring cultures. As Egyptian civilization came into contact with Levantine and Mesopotamian peoples through trade and conquest, Egyptians would have encountered flood stories and incorporated some elements into their own mythology. The myth of Apophis, a chaos serpent who threatened to swallow the sun and bring darkness and disorder to the cosmos, may represent an Egyptian adaptation of the universal flood motif, translating the threat of inundation into cosmic mythology. The annual defeat of Apophis by Ra, the sun god, parallels the theme of cosmic order reasserted after a period of chaos, though it is expressed in Egyptian terms and integrated into a distinctly Egyptian theological framework. The proliferation of flood narratives across so many ancient cultures raises the fundamental question that scholars have grappled with for generations. What accounts for this striking convergence? The explanations fall into several broad categories, each with its own strengths and limitations. The first explanation is that a single catastrophic historical event, so terrible and far-reaching that it touched the whole human family, left an indelible mark on human memory and gave rise to the various flood traditions. Proponents of this view have proposed various candidates for the historical event. Some point to the melting of glaciers at the end of the last ice age, an event that occurred roughly 10,000 years ago and caused sea levels to rise dramatically, inundating vast coastal areas where early humans had lived. Populations displaced by this rising water would have carried stories of the drowned world with them as they migrated inland and to other continents. Over millennia, these stories would have been elaborated and mythologized, but they would preserve a core memory of a real event. Others propose the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, mentioned earlier, which suggests that around 7,000 years ago, after the last ice age when sea levels had stabilized, the Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural barrier at the Bosporus and poured into a lower freshwater lake with tremendous force and violence. The catastrophe would have been sudden and dramatic for the people living around the lake, which would eventually become the Black Sea. As these communities fled the rising waters, they would have spread the story of the deluge to neighbouring peoples, and through trade and cultural contact the story would have spread throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. The hypothesis is appealing because it places the flood in a specific region and time that correspond roughly to when writing was developing, and when we begin to have textual records. However, the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis remains contested among geologists and archaeologists. The timing is uncertain, and the magnitude of the event, while dramatic, may not have been as catastrophic as initially proposed. More importantly, even if the Black Sea Deluge did occur, it does not obviously explain flood myths from regions with no plausible connection to the Black Sea, such as Australia, the Americas, or parts of Asia far removed from any direct contact with Mediterranean peoples. The second explanation is that flood narratives arose independently in different cultures as responses to their own local experiences of catastrophic flooding. Rivers flood regularly in river valleys, and occasionally these floods are so severe that they seem to threaten the entire world. For people living in these regions, the experience of a great flood would be formative, a traumatic event that reshapes society and leaves emotional and psychological scars that are transmitted through generations. The narrative impulse is universal. People everywhere tell stories to make sense of traumatic experiences. It is not surprising, then, that cultures living in flood-prone regions would develop flood myths as a way of processing and integrating the experience of periodic catastrophic inundation, this explanation has the advantage of being parsimonious, requiring no assumption of a single global event or of cultural transmission across vast distances. It accounts for the flood myths in regions that have little historical contact with one another, such as North and South America. It explains why flood myths are particularly prominent in cultures based on large rivers, such as those of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley and China, and less prominent in cultures based in mountains or coastal regions without major river systems. It also explains why the details of flood myths vary so widely, shaped by local geography, climate and cultural values. However, this explanation struggles to account for the remarkably detailed parallels between the Mesopotamian and Hebrew versions, parallels that go far beyond the generic response to a flooding event. If the Hebrew flood story was simply a local response to flooding in Palestine, why would it include so many specific details that match the Babylonian account? The sending of birds to test for dry land, the gathering of animals 2 by 2, the resting of the boat on a mountain, the building of an altar and making of an offering. These details are too specific and too consistent across different cultures to be easily explained as independent inventions. The third explanation is cultural diffusion, the transmission of the flood story from one culture to another through trade, conquest, migration, and cultural contact. This explanation can account for the parallels between Mesopotamian and Hebrew versions, as well as their spread to other Mediterranean cultures, if we assume that Mesopotamian culture, as the oldest literate civilization with the most developed literary traditions, exported its narratives to neighbouring peoples. Peoples who came into contact with Mesopotamian civilization, either directly or through intermediaries, would have encountered the flood story in the Sumerian, Akkadian, or Babylonian versions and adopted it, adapting it to their own language, theology, and cultural context. This explanation has considerable evidence in its favour. The Hittites clearly adopted the Gilgamesh epic and the flood narrative within it, copying the Babylonian text into their own language. The Hebrews, living on the border of the Mesopotamian world, would have had ample opportunity to encounter Mesopotamian traditions, either through early contact in the 2nd millennium, or, more definitively, through the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. Greek traders and travellers brought ideas from Mesopotamia and Egypt to the Greek world. The spread of the flood myth through cultural diffusion is not merely plausible, but demonstrable in numerous cases. However, cultural diffusion alone cannot explain flood myths in regions that had little or no contact with Mesopotamia or any other Near Eastern culture. The flood narratives of the Americas, Australia, and parts of Asia are more easily explained through independent invention or local experience than through diffusion from the ancient Near East. The Ojibwe, the Hopi, the Mapuche, and other indigenous American peoples have no plausible historical connection to Mesopotamian culture, yet they have flood myths. Either these myths arose independently in response to local flooding experiences, or they preserve memories of the post-glacial sea level rise that affected coastal regions worldwide, or there is some deeper archetypal pattern in human thought that generates flood narratives. A fourth explanation, favoured by some anthropologists and comparative mythologists, is that the flood narrative represents an archetypal narrative pattern, a universal structure of myth that arises from the basic human experience of life and death, order and chaos, creation and destruction. In this view, many cultures generate flood myths not because they share a common historical source, but because the flood is a natural symbolic representation of chaos and destruction, a primordial water that precedes and threatens all ordered creation. The flood story allows people to think about the contingency of civilization, the fragility of order, the possibility of total loss and renewal. It is a narrative that cultures create independently because it serves fundamental psychological and spiritual needs. This explanation is supported by the observation that flood myths appear even in cultures with no connection to river valleys or regular flooding, and in regions where ocean or weather patterns would not lead to the experience of catastrophic inundation. If flood myths were purely responses to local flooding, one would expect them to be concentrated in river valley civilizations. In fact, they are widespread, suggesting that something other than environmental experience accounts for their prevalence. Yet this explanation, while intellectually appealing, is difficult to test and verify. It relies on assumptions about universal human psychology and archetypal patterns that are not always supported by evidence. It also risks circularity. If any culture with a flood myth is said to have created it independently because of universal archetypal patterns, then the hypothesis becomes unfalsifiable, explaining everything and predicting nothing. The most likely explanation is that multiple processes have been at work simultaneously. In regions where catastrophic flooding is a genuine hazard, such as Mesopotamia and Egypt, local experience gives rise to flood narratives shaped by the specific geography and theology of those regions. These narratives, particularly in Mesopotamia where they were written down early and widely distributed, are then transmitted to neighbouring cultures through trade, conquest and cultural contact. Peoples who receive these stories adapt them to their own context, but the core narrative structure and many specific details are preserved. Meanwhile, in regions far removed from any contact with Near Eastern cultures, independent flood narratives arise in response to local experiences, to post-glacial sea level rise, or to universal archetypal patterns in human consciousness. The result is a worldwide distribution of flood myths, some closely related to one another through historical transmission, others arising independently but following similar narrative logic. As the centuries passed and civilizations rose and fell in the ancient world, the flood narratives continued to be transmitted, adapted, and integrated into ever more complex literary and theological systems. The story that had originated as a simple folk memory of catastrophic inundation became woven into the great epics and sacred texts that defined civilizations and gave meaning to human existence. Of all these elaborations, none was more significant or far-reaching than its incorporation into the Epic of Gilgamesh, a work that became the most widely read and influential literary text of the ancient Near East. The Gilgamesh epic did not spring forth fully formed. It grew over centuries, beginning as separate stories told about a legendary king of Uruk, who may have been based on a historical figure but who became, in literature, a symbol of human striving and human limitation. The stories circulated in oral form, passed among storytellers and scribes, gradually coalescing into a longer narrative. By the time the epic took its standard literary form, probably in the early second millennium before the Common Era, it had become a profound meditation on kingship, friendship, mortality, and the human condition. The Gilgamesh who appears in the epic is a man of extraordinary power and beauty, possessed of 2/3 divine and 1/3 human parentage. He is the king of Uruk, a great city that he has built and enhanced with magnificent walls and temples. Yet he is also tyrannical, abusing his power over his people, taking what he wishes, enslaving the strong to his service. The people cry out in complaint to the gods, asking them to intervene. The gods hear the complaint and decide to create a match for Gilgamesh, a being of equal power who might restrain him through friendship. They create Enkidu, a wild man who knows nothing of civilization, who runs with the animals and drinks from their watering places. When Gilgamesh hears of this wild man, he sends a woman to seduce him and draw him away from the animals. Enkidu, experiencing human sexuality for the first time, is changed by the encounter. He cannot return to his previous simple existence. He comes to Uruk and meets Gilgamesh, and the two men wrestle, each testing the other's strength. They are evenly matched, and neither can overcome the other. From this moment of perfect opposition comes perfect friendship. They become inseparable companions, and Gilgamesh, no longer alone with his power, becomes less tyrannical, more capable of empathy and genuine connection. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu undertake a series of adventures. They journey to the cedar forest to face the monster Humbaba and cut down the sacred trees. Gilgamesh attracts the attention of the goddess Ishtar, who desires him and offers him great gifts and power. Gilgamesh refuses her, reminding her of the fate that has befallen her previous lovers and insulting her in the process. Enraged, Ishtar sends the bull of heaven to punish Gilgamesh and Enkidu. The two men slay the bull, but their triumph brings down divine wrath upon them. The gods decide that one of them must die for their transgression and their disrespect. Enkidu falls gravely ill, and despite Gilgamesh's desperate prayers and pleas, Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh is devastated. He weeps and mourns his friend, placing rich garments and ornaments on the body, making offerings and maintaining the vigil until the corpse begins to decay. For the first time in his life, Gilgamesh has encountered genuine loss, has been confronted with the finality of death, has understood that even the strongest man must eventually fall into the darkness. He cannot accept this. He cannot believe that his immortal destiny, as the part divine son of the goddess Ninsun, will not protect him from the same fate. He vows to find a way to overcome death, to discover the secret of eternal life, to ensure that he and all humanity can escape the darkness that has claimed Enkidu. This desperate quest drives the second half of the epic. Gilgamesh leaves Uruk and wanders into the wilderness, travelling to the ends of the earth, seeking the one person who is known to have achieved immortality. That person is Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, the one man to whom the gods granted eternal life. No human knows where he lives, for he dwells beyond the mountains, beyond the edges of the known world, at the confluence of the waters where the earth meets the cosmic ocean. Gilgamesh's quest to reach him takes him through dangerous lands, past guardians and obstacles, through trials that test his courage and determination. When he finally reaches the place where Utnapishtim dwells, he approaches exhausted, desperate, his body scarred by thorns and hardship, his face burned by the sun. Utnapishtim receives him, and in response to Gilgamesh's plea to know the secret of immortality, tells him the story of the flood. He describes how the god Enlil called an assembly of the great gods and announced his intention to destroy humanity with a flood. He tells how Ea, the god of wisdom, whispered the warning through the reed wall, instructing him to build the boat. He gives precise details of the boat's construction, the gathering of animals and family, the sealing of the door. He describes the storm in language that conveys the utter devastation, the terror of a world being unmade. The account that Utnapishtim gives is closely related to the earlier Atrahasis epic, but has been refined and amplified. The descriptions are more vivid, more emotionally resonant. The storm is described as a 6-day and 7-night tempest in which even the gods are terrified. Utnapishtim describes how he himself wept to see the destruction, how all humanity had been turned to clay, how the surface of the sea was flat and still like a roof. The boat comes to rest on Mount Nimush after the deluge subsides, and Utnapishtim sends out the succession of birds, a dove, a swallow, and a raven. When the raven does not return, he knows the earth is dry. He releases the animals and makes his offering, and the gods gather around the smoke like flies, drawn by the hunger created by the days without offerings. Enlil arrives at this gathering angry at finding a human alive, but Ea intervenes, arguing that it was unjust to destroy the innocent along with the guilty. Enlil relents, blessed Utnapishtim and his wife, and granted them a place far from other humans at the edge of the world where they would live forever, untouched by time or change. This, Utnapishtim explains to Gilgamesh, is his immortality, and it is not something that can be granted again. It was a unique circumstance, never to be repeated. Gilgamesh realizes the futility of his quest. Immortality is not available to humans who live in cities and kingdoms, who are bound by the normal processes of life and death. The only way to achieve what Utnapishtim has achieved would be to survive a world-ending catastrophe, and no such catastrophe will come again, for the gods have promised never to flood the earth again. Yet Utnapishtim, pitying the exhausted and desperate man before him, offers a consolation. There is a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that does not grant immortality but can restore youth. If Gilgamesh can find this plant and consume it, he will experience something like a renewal, a return to the vigor of the youth, though he will still eventually die. Gilgamesh, desperate, agrees. He ties stones to his feet as anchors and dives to the bottom of the sea, where he finds the plant growing among the rocks. He returns to the surface with the plant, knowing that he has achieved something remarkable. He decides to take it back to Uruk and share it with the elders, so that they might also benefit from its renewal. But as he stops to bathe and rest beside a pool of water, a serpent smells the plant's fragrance, slithers into the water and takes it. The serpent sloughs off its old skin in the water and emerges renewed and young. Gilgamesh has been robbed of his prize. He sits by the pool and weeps, understanding at last that the quest has failed, that there is no escape from mortality, that he must return to Uruk and accept his human fate. Yet the epic does not end in despair. When Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, he looks upon the walls he's built, the temples, the ordered spaces of civilization. He realizes that immortality of a different kind is available to him. Through his deeds, through the city he has built, through the memory of his friendship with Enkidu and the stories of his adventures that will be told for generations, he will achieve a form of permanence. His name will be remembered, his works will endure. This is the immortality available to humans. not the endless life granted to gods and to Utnapishtim, but the memory and legacy that survives the individual death. This reframing of immortality is the great insight of the Gilgamesh epic, and it transforms the flood narrative from a simple tale of survival into part of a profound meditation on mortality and meaning. The flood story, embedded in the epic, becomes a teaching tool, a lesson that Utnapishtim imparts to Gilgamesh to help him understand the nature of immortality and the limits of human ambition. It shows that even a survivor of a world-ending catastrophe cannot escape death, cannot achieve the kind of unlimited existence that humans often desire. What can be achieved instead is a meaningful life, a life that contributes to the survival and flourishing of civilization, a life whose memory persists even after the individual has died. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its embedded flood narrative, became the literary masterpiece of the ancient Near East. Copies were made in the scribal schools, both as a teaching text and as a work of literature to be appreciated for its artistic merit. The story was translated into other languages, Hittite, Hurrian, and eventually into Greek. Fragments have been found in excavations from sites spanning from Mesopotamia to Anatolia to Egypt, evidence of its wide distribution and popularity. For many in the ancient world, this was the canonical version of the flood story, the text that defined how the narrative should be told, the standard against which other versions were measured. The role of the epic in standardizing and spreading the flood narrative cannot be overstated. Before the epic, the flood story existed in multiple versions, each adapted to the needs of different cities and theological traditions. The Sumerian Eridu Genesis presented the flood as part of a historical sequence of ancient kings. The Atrahasis epic focused on the relationship between gods and humans and the mechanism of divine punishment and mercy. But the Gilgamesh epic, through its integration of the flood story into a larger narrative about kingship and mortality, gave the flood its most resonant theological meaning. It placed the flood within a framework of human existence, human ambition, and human limitation. It showed how the ancient catastrophe could illuminate the eternal human condition. As the Mesopotamian empires declined and new powers rose, the Epic of Gilgamesh continued to circulate, continued to be copied and read, continued to influence how people understood the flood and what it meant. The story of Utnapishtim became almost synonymous with the flood survivor, overshadowing earlier names like Ziusudra and Atrahasis in popular memory. When later cultures encountered Mesopotamian traditions, they often encountered them through the lens of the Gilgamesh epic, and their flood narratives were shaped accordingly. The epic also established certain narrative conventions that became standard in later flood stories. The warning from a divine figure, the construction of a vessel, the gathering of animals and family, the overwhelming storm, the testing of the receded waters with birds, the making of an offering, the blessing or covenant that follows. These elements, arranged in the Gilgamesh version in a particular sequence, became the template for flood narratives that followed. Cultures that adopted or created their own flood stories often incorporated these elements, even if they adapted them to their local context. The flood narrative, in other words, became a standardized form through its literary embodiment in the epic, and that standardized form facilitated its transmission and adaptation across cultures. The Gilgamesh epic also established the theological meaning that many later flood narratives inherited. The flood as a watershed moment in human history, a moment when the old world was destroyed and a new world was born, when the relationship between gods and humans was fundamentally altered. In the epic, the flood results in Utnapishtim being granted immortality and positioned at the edge of the world, no longer part of human civilization. The human world continues, but it is now separated from the pre-flood world by a boundary of water, a boundary that marks a fundamental change in the conditions of human existence. This motif of the flood as a dividing line, a marker between an old age and a new age, appears in many later flood narratives, including the Hebrew scriptures, where the flood divides the age of Adam and his immediate descendants from the age of Noah and his descendants, with the covenant made after the flood establishing new principles for human existence. Part 9. The world into which the flood narratives were born was a world of cities rising and falling, of empires expanding and contracting, of knowledge accumulated in libraries and then scattered when those libraries burned. The cities of Mesopotamia, built on the flat, fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, were centers of learning and culture. but they were also vulnerable to the very forces that had nurtured them. The unpredictable rivers could flood and destroy. Invaders could come from the mountains to the north, or the deserts to the south. Diseases could sweep through a city and carry off thousands. Wars between rival cities could reduce once great centres to rubble. The people of these cities lived with a constant awareness of fragility, a knowledge that what had been built could be unmade. In the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, as the power of the city-states of Sumer began to wane, the Akkadians moved southward from the north and gradually absorbed Sumerian territory into a larger political structure. The Akkadian Empire, established by Sargon around 2334 before the Common Era, was one of the earliest large empires in human history. For a brief period, it united most of Mesopotamia under a single ruler. But empires in this ancient world were inherently unstable. They depended on military might, on the personal authority of the king, on the loyalty of officials who might at any moment shift their allegiance. When Sargon's successors proved less capable than he, the empire fragmented. Invasions from the Gutians, a mountain people from the Zagros, hastened the collapse. The Akkadian Empire, for all its power and extent, lasted only about 2 centuries before dissolving into regional fragments. Yet the culture and literature of the Akkadians did not disappear with their empire. The Akkadian language became the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, the language used for diplomacy and commerce, even as local rulers reasserted their independence. The literature of the Akkadians, including the Atrahasis epic and the later expanded versions of Gilgamesh, continued to be copied and studied. When a new power rose, when the city of Babylon grew from a small settlement to become the dominant force in Mesopotamia, the Babylonians inherited Akkadian culture and built upon it. They preserved the old texts, maintained the scribal traditions, and produced their own versions of the classics, including the standard version of the Gilgamesh epic that we know today, dating to around 1300 before the Common Era. This process of cultural preservation and transmission continued even as political power shifted. The Hittites, who ruled in Anatolia from roughly 1700 to 1200 before the Common Era, maintained libraries in their capital of Hattusa. When archaeologists excavated Hattusa in the 19th century, they found thousands of clay tablets, including copies of Mesopotamian texts in the Hittite language. The fact that a distant power, controlling a kingdom far from the heartland of Mesopotamia, carefully preserved copies of Mesopotamian literature demonstrates the reach of Mesopotamian culture and the respect in which its texts were held. The Hittites, for all their independence and their own rich cultural traditions, saw value in preserving the wisdom and stories of the older civilization. The Assyrians, who rose to power in northern Mesopotamia and eventually built an empire that stretched from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, were similarly devoted to preserving Mesopotamian texts. The great Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century before the Common Era, was not only a warrior and administrator but also a scholar and collector. He assembled one of the great libraries of the ancient world in his palace at Nineveh, gathering tablets from across his empire and having scribes copy important texts to ensure they would be preserved. When Nineveh was destroyed by invading armies in 612 before the Common Era, the library was buried under rubble and the tablets were baked hard by the fires that consumed the city. Yet they survived, entombed in the ruins for over 2,000 years until archaeologists uncovered them in the 19th century. Among the thousands of tablets found in Ashurbanipal's library was a nearly complete copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed in cuneiform on 12 tablets, each containing a portion of the epic. This copy, made by scribes in the 7th century before the Common Era, is the best preserved version we have, and it is from this version that modern scholars have reconstructed the complete epic. The existence of this copy, preserved in a royal library far from the city of Babylon where the epic had originated, testifies to the enduring importance of the text and its transmission across centuries and empires. Yet the long history of the Mesopotamian civilizations was ultimately one of decline and displacement. In the 6th century before the Common Era, the Babylonian Empire, which had controlled southern Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years, fell to the Persians under Cyrus the Great. The Persians were not hostile to Babylonian culture. They respected the old traditions and allowed local rulers considerable autonomy. The temples continued to function, the scribal schools continued to operate, the texts continued to be copied. But the political centre of power had shifted away from Mesopotamia. The great days of Babylon and Assyria had ended. the lands along the Tigris and Euphrates would never again be the political centre of a major empire. As Mesopotamian political power waned, the cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East came increasingly to the fore. The Levant, the lands of the Hebrews and the Phoenicians, and the various city-states that dotted the Mediterranean coast became centres of commerce and culture. The Persians, and later the Greeks under Alexander, dominated the political landscape. Yet the culture of ancient Mesopotamia did not disappear. It was preserved in texts, in the memory of scholars, in the traditions that were transmitted to the cultures that succeeded it. For the Hebrews, the flood narrative took on new importance as their own national history unfolded in ways that mirrored the themes of the ancient flood story. The Kingdom of Israel, established in the lands west of Mesopotamia in the 10th century before the Common Era, grew powerful under kings like David and Solomon. But like the great empires of Mesopotamia, it was vulnerable to external pressures and internal conflicts. The kingdom divided into two separate states, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Both states found themselves under pressure from the great empires that rose around them. The northern kingdom of Israel was conquered and destroyed by the Assyrians in the 8th century, and many of its people were deported and lost to history. The southern kingdom of Judah managed to survive longer, but in 586 before the Common Era, it too fell to invading armies, this time the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. The destruction of Jerusalem and the deportation of many Judeans to Babylon was a catastrophe comparable to the Great Flood in Hebrew theological understanding. It was interpreted as a divine judgment, punishment for the people's unfaithfulness and wickedness, a dismantling of the world as it had been known. Yet even in this catastrophe, the Hebrews understood themselves to be survivors, like Noah surviving the flood, like Utnapishtim preserved through the deluge. A remnant of the people survived the destruction, and they carried with them their traditions, their scriptures, their understanding of their relationship with God. The exiled Hebrews in Babylon would encounter the great literature and learning of Mesopotamian civilization, and they would encounter the very stories that their own traditions had adapted, the Akkadian and Babylonian flood narratives. It was probably during this period of exile, in the 6th century before the Common Era, that Hebrew scribes encountered the Babylonian versions of the flood story and incorporated elements of them into the Hebrew scriptures. The priestly writers who compiled and edited the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, drew on various earlier sources and wove them together into a coherent narrative. The flood story was one element in this larger narrative, part of the prehistory of humanity that preceded the call of Abraham and the covenant with the Hebrew people. By incorporating the flood story, with its Mesopotamian echoes and details, into their own sacred text, the Hebrew scribes were not merely borrowing from their captors, they were demonstrating that Hebrew tradition was part of the wider heritage of human civilization, that the truths they affirmed were connected to and continuous with the ancient wisdom of the lands around them. The standardized form of the Hebrew flood narrative, the version found in the book of Genesis that has been transmitted to the present day, was likely finalized during or shortly after the Babylonian exile. This version, while showing clear dependence on Mesopotamian sources for its basic structure and many details, was thoroughly transformed by Hebrew theology. The plurality of gods became a single God. The arbitrary, capricious decisions of the divine council became the judgments of a righteous and just deity. The focus shifted from humanity's noise or overpopulation to humanity's moral corruption. The purpose of the flood shifted from a reset of the population to a cleansing of the world of evil, and the promise that followed the flood became not merely a statement that future floods would be moderated, but a covenant, a binding agreement between God and Noah and all of humanity, sealed with the sign of the rainbow. As the Hebrews began to be restored to their homeland under the Persians, the texts they had preserved and compiled in Babylon were brought back with them. The Torah, the Hebrew scriptures, became the foundation of Jewish religious and cultural identity. The flood story, now part of these sacred texts, became one of the most important narratives in Jewish tradition. It was read in the synagogues, discussed in the schools, referenced in the teachings of rabbis and sages. Over the following centuries, as Judaism developed its rich tradition of commentary and interpretation, the flood story was analysed, debated, and elaborated upon in countless ways. The names of the sons of Noah, the animals on the ark, the length of the flood, the age of Noah, all these details and many more became subjects of careful study and imaginative interpretation. When Christianity emerged from Judaism in the 1st century of the Common Era, the flood narrative was inherited as part of the shared scriptural heritage. The Gospel writers referenced the flood as a historical event, and Jesus himself used the flood as a metaphor, saying that the coming of the Son of Man would be like the days of Noah, when people were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, unaware of the danger until the flood came and swept them all away. This image established the flood story as a paradigmatic moment of divine judgment and separation, a precedent for understanding eschatological events, the ultimate end times when God would finally judge the world. The flood narrative also became important in early Christian theology in another way. The ark came to be understood as a type or prefiguration of the church, the vessel of salvation carrying believers safely through the waters of judgment. Just as God saved Noah and his family through the ark, so God saves the faithful through the church, the body of Christ. This typological interpretation, reading the Old Testament as a prophecy of and preparation for the New Testament, would become standard in Christian biblical interpretation for many centuries. The flood was not merely a historical event from the distant past, but a pattern that was repeated and fulfilled in the redemptive history of Christ and the Church. In the medieval Christian tradition, the flood narrative was subject to intense allegorical interpretation. Every detail of the ark was examined for hidden spiritual meanings. The fact that Noah was described as 600 years old when the flood came was seen as significant. The 3 decks of the ark were interpreted as representing different levels of spiritual understanding or different aspects of creation. The pitch or bitumen used to seal the ark was sometimes interpreted as representing Christ's atonement or the grace of God. The precise dimensions given in Genesis, cubits and proportions, were analysed to see if they held hidden numerical meanings. While these interpretations may seem fanciful to modern readers, they represented a serious attempt to extract all possible meaning from a text, understood as divinely inspired and containing layers of truth. Yet even as the flood story was incorporated into Christian and Jewish tradition and subjected to elaborate interpretation, the text itself remained grounded in its Mesopotamian sources. The details and structure that Hebrew scribes had adopted and adapted from Babylonian sources remained recognizable to scholars who could read both traditions. The flood narrative remained a bridge between 2 great civilizations, a shared story that connected Mesopotamia to the Hebrew world and eventually to the Christian world that would inherit both. By the time the Mesopotamian civilizations had fully faded, when Aramaic and other languages had replaced Akkadian, when the clay tablets were no longer the primary writing medium and parchment had become the material of choice, the flood story had been transformed from a local memory of catastrophic inundation into a foundational narrative of world civilization. It had spread from Mesopotamia to the Levant, to Greece, to Egypt, to India, to China, and eventually to every inhabited corner of the globe as the religions that carried it spread through trade, conquest, and missionary effort. The story had been written down, preserved in multiple languages, incorporated into sacred texts, subjected to commentary and interpretation, and retold in infinite variations. Yet the core narrative remained recognizable. A world threatened with destruction by water, a righteous figure warned by a divine being, the preservation of a remnant of life, the eventual restoration of the world, and a renewed covenant between the divine and the human. The long history of the flood narrative through the ancient world is a history of memory, transmission, and transformation. It is a story about how human beings preserve what matters to them, how they pass knowledge and meaning from one generation to the next, how they find continuity and identity through the stories they tell. The flood in this sense is not merely a natural disaster or a historical event. It is a narrative vessel, a container into which different cultures poured their hopes, fears, and theological understandings. It is a mirror in which each civilization saw its own concerns reflected. In the 19th century, when European scholars and archaeologists began to excavate the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia and to decipher the cuneiform script, they discovered these old texts with a sense of wonder and astonishment. Here were narratives that were thousands of years old, stories that had been lost and buried for over 2 millennia, suddenly becoming readable again. When the Gilgamesh epic was translated and the flood narrative within it was understood, scholars realized they were looking at something extraordinary, a story that predated the Hebrew scriptures by nearly 2,000 years, yet contained details that echoed those scriptures so closely that they could not be coincidence. The discovery of the Mesopotamian flood narratives in the 19th and 20th centuries transformed biblical scholarship. It was now clear that the Hebrew flood story was not an isolated event, not the unique creation of Hebrew tradition, but part of a larger intellectual and cultural landscape shared across the ancient Near East. This realization was sometimes met with alarm by conservative religious thinkers, who saw it as evidence that the biblical narrative was merely borrowed mythology, not a divinely revealed account of historical events. Others saw it differently, arguing that the flood story, whether based on a historical event or arising from human experience of natural disasters, had been adopted and transformed by Hebrew scribes to express theological truths about God's judgment and mercy, about the consequences of human sin, and about the possibility of salvation. The rediscovery of the ancient texts also raised new questions about the historical basis of the flood narrative. Had there been a great flood that covered the entire earth, as the narrative suggested? Geologists examined the evidence and found no trace of a worldwide flood in the recent past. The geological record showed no layer of sediment separating different strata that could be identified as the product of a global deluge. Ice ages and their associated sea level changes had occurred, but these happened long before humans existed. However, geologists did find evidence of severe local floods, of catastrophic inundations that had changed river courses and destroyed civilizations. The most intriguing geological evidence came from the Black Sea region, as mentioned earlier. Around 7,000 years ago, according to geological studies, the Mediterranean Sea may have broken through a natural barrier at what is now the Bosporus Strait and poured into the Black Sea with tremendous force. The Black Sea at that time was a freshwater lake, lower than the Mediterranean, and the influx of seawater would have been a catastrophic event for the people living around its shores. Communities that had settled on the lake shores would have been forced to flee as the water level rose. The agricultural lands they had cultivated would have been inundated and rendered unusable. This catastrophe, if it occurred as geologists have theorized, would have displaced thousands of people and forced them to migrate to new lands. As these displaced peoples moved into surrounding regions, they would have carried with them stories of the drowned world, stories that would have resonated with local populations already familiar with flooding and water-related disasters. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis is appealing because it offers a historical grounding for the flood narratives while remaining consistent with geological knowledge. It explains how a catastrophic flood in one region could be transmitted to neighbouring regions and eventually become incorporated into multiple cultural traditions. However, the hypothesis remains speculative. The timing and magnitude of the proposed deluge are still debated among geologists. Moreover, even if the Black Sea Deluge did occur, it does not explain flood narratives in regions far from the Black Sea, such as the Americas or Australia. Other scholars have proposed that the flood narratives reflect memories of the post-glacial sea level rise that occurred after the last ice age, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. At the end of the last glacial period, vast ice sheets that had covered North America, Europe, and Asia began to melt. This melting released enormous quantities of water into the oceans, causing sea levels to rise gradually but dramatically. In some regions, the sea level rose by hundreds of feet, inundating vast areas of land that had previously been dry and habitable. Coastal populations that had lived on lands now submerged would have experienced a slow but inexorable encroachment of the ocean. If this process occurred over centuries or millennia, the accumulated experience of generations watching their world being drowned would have left an indelible mark on human consciousness. The memory of these drowned lands and the slow rise of the sea could, over the course of thousands of years of retelling, have been transformed into narratives of a great flood that covered the entire world. This hypothesis has the advantage of being grounded in well-established geology and of explaining why flood narratives are so widespread geographically. Virtually all coastlines experience some degree of inundation during the post-glacial period. Populations living on coasts or in river valleys that drained into the sea would have experienced the effects. The memory of this environmental change could have persisted in human tradition and emerged in myths and narratives. Yet this hypothesis also has limitations. The post-glacial sea level rise was a gradual process, unfolding over thousands of years, not a sudden cataclysm. By the time writing was invented, the process would have been largely complete, so the oral traditions preserving it would have to have been maintained for thousands of years with remarkable stability. Moreover, Not all cultures with flood myths are located in regions where post-glacial sea level rise would have been significant. The question of the historical basis of the flood narratives may ultimately be unanswerable with certainty. What we can say is that the flood narratives reflect human engagement with natural disasters, particularly flooding, which is a genuine and recurring threat in many parts of the world. Whether the narratives are grounded in a specific historical event or arise from cumulative human experience of flooding, they serve important functions in human culture and consciousness. They help people process fear and loss. They establish moral frameworks for understanding why disasters occur. They affirm the possibility of survival and renewal. They connect communities to a shared heritage and shared values. The preservation and transmission of these narratives from the ancient world to the present demonstrates the power of writing and the deep human need to preserve and transmit meaning across generations. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia, baked hard by fire or left to dry in the sun, survived for thousands of years, waiting to be discovered by archaeologists equipped with the knowledge to read them. The texts written on parchment and paper, first by Hebrew scribes and later by Christian monks, were copied and recopied, carried across continents and centuries, maintained in libraries and monasteries even when the broader culture in which they originated had been swept away. The flood narrative endured because it mattered, because it spoke to fundamental aspects of human experience and understanding. In more recent centuries, as the ancient texts were rediscovered and translated, as scientific methods were applied to understanding the natural world, the flood narrative has taken on new dimensions of meaning. It is studied by archaeologists for what it reveals about ancient civilizations. It is analysed by linguists and comparatists for what it shows about the transmission of cultural ideas. It is examined by geologists for what it might tell us about ancient environmental changes. It is explored by psychologists and anthropologists for what it reveals about universal patterns in human thought and experience. It is, simultaneously, a historical document, a literary masterpiece, a theological statement, and a psychological symbol. The flood narratives also speak to modern concerns in ways that might not have been apparent in the ancient world. As contemporary societies face climate change, rising sea levels, and the prospect of environmental catastrophe, the ancient flood stories take on new urgency. They remind us that human civilizations are built in fragile places, on coasts, and in river valleys, vulnerable to the forces of nature. They remind us that a world transformed by rising waters is not merely an ancient problem but a perennial one. They suggest that the response to such threats requires not only technical solutions, but also moral and spiritual preparation, not only dikes and canals, but wisdom and humility about human limitations. The figure of the flood survivor, whether called Ziusudra or Utnapishtim or Noah, also speaks to modern sensibilities. In a world that has experienced 20th century genocides and environmental destruction on a massive scale, the idea of a remnant preserved through catastrophe, a seed of humanity or knowledge or tradition that survives to repopulate and rebuild the world, resonates with particular force. The survivor becomes a symbol of human resilience, the capacity to endure and to maintain meaning, even in the face of overwhelming destruction. The stories of survivors of modern disasters, wars, and catastrophes echo the ancient narratives, suggesting that the pattern of devastation and survival is not merely an ancient concern but a permanent feature of human existence. The transmission of the flood narrative from Mesopotamia through the ancient Mediterranean world to the modern era also illustrates the ways in which knowledge and culture move across borders and time. The story did not belong to any single people or culture. It was adapted and adopted, transformed and transmitted, incorporated into different traditions while maintaining its essential structure and power. The fact that versions of the story appear in cultures separated by vast distances and centuries of isolation suggests something profound about human nature and human consciousness. The ability to imagine a world unmade by water, to conceive of survival and renewal, to find meaning in catastrophe, seems to be something deeply rooted in human experience and imagination. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun sets and the world grows dim, the ancient flood narratives continue to speak to those who listen. They speak of a world that was now long vanished. They speak of peoples and cities that are dust, whose languages are dead, whose gods are forgotten by all but scholars. They speak of a catastrophe so immense that it seemed to end the world, yet from which life emerged again. They speak of the fragility of human civilization and the persistence of human meaning. They speak of the connection between the ancient world and our own, showing us that the concerns that occupied the scribes of Babylon and the priests of Jerusalem, the fears that shaped the stories told to children in houses that no longer stand, are not so very different from the concerns that occupy us today. The libraries that once housed the clay tablets of Mesopotamia have long since turned to dust. The cities that were centres of learning and commerce are now archaeological sites, mounds of rubble from which fragments of the past are carefully excavated. The languages in which the oldest flood stories were written have not been spoken for over 2,000 years, yet the stories themselves have endured, preserved in writing, transmitted through centuries, adapted to new contexts, integrated into new traditions. The flood narrative has become part of the permanent heritage of human civilization, a story that belongs to all peoples who have inherited the traditions of the ancient Near East, which is to say, a substantial portion of humanity. As you rest tonight, knowing that somewhere in the darkness beyond your window, the same stars shine that shone on the scribes of Babylon as they pressed their reed styluses into clay tablets, the same ancient rhythms of water and earth continue, the rivers still flood with the coming of spring, the seas still rise and fall with the tides, the rain still comes when the gods will it, or when the weather patterns shift, or when the blind forces of nature turn their attention to the earth. The world has changed in countless ways since the days when the flood narratives were first composed and written down. Cities rise where ancient cities have fallen. Technologies that would have seemed miraculous to the ancients are now commonplace. The calendar has turned thousands of times. Yet human beings still face the possibility of loss and disaster, still seek ways to preserve what matters most, still tell stories to make sense of the chaos and to affirm the possibility of survival and renewal. The flood narratives, preserved from the ancient world, carry with them the voices of scribes long dead, the concerns of civilizations long vanished, the hopes and fears of countless generations who have lived through flooding and drought, who have watched cities be built and cities fall, who have maintained traditions and passed them on to their children. These narratives testify to the human capacity for memory, the power of the written word to transcend time and distance, the enduring importance of stories in helping us understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. They remind us that we are not the first to face catastrophe, nor will we be the last. They tell us that meaning can persist through destruction, that renewal is possible, that the darkness does not have the final word. In the houses and temples where the flood stories were once recited, in the schools where young scribes learned to write them, in the markets and streets where people gathered to hear them retold, the narratives lived and moved and shaped how people understood their world. Now, thousands of years later, in a world so transformed that those ancient peoples could not have imagined it, the stories continue to live, continuing to move through the culture, continuing to shape how we think about catastrophe and survival, about the power of nature and the resilience of human civilization. The past rests peacefully in the earth, in the clay tablets that archaeologists carefully excavate and study, in the memory of the dead who first told these tales, in the traditions that carry them forward into the future. The waters that threatened the world in the ancient stories have long since receded, leaving behind fertile soil and the memory of deluge. Those waters were real, and they were catastrophic, and they were survived. The stories that grew from that experience remain, carrying with them the wisdom and the fear and the hope of ancient peoples who learned to live in a world where water could rise and cover everything, and yet life could persist, could survive, could begin again. Let the steadiness of your breath carry you forward into sleep. Let the rhythm of your heartbeat, constant and reliable, remind you of the persistence of life through all the ages and all the changes. The ancient world rests beneath the modern one, and the stories of that world, preserved in writing, preserved in memory, preserved in the traditions we inherit, continue to move through our consciousness like waters flowing downward to the sea. Rest assured that the world has survived its trials before, that knowledge and meaning have been preserved through catastrophe, that human beings have found ways to carry what matters most through the darkest times. Let your mind settle and grow quiet, like water after a storm, clear and still beneath the starlit sky. The rediscovery of the ancient flood narratives in the 19th and 20th centuries brought these texts back into living consciousness after centuries of obscurity, when they existed only in the memory of scholars and in the religious traditions that preserved them, the work of archaeologists and philologists, patient and meticulous, uncovered tablets in the ruins of ancient cities and slowly learned to read the wedge-shaped script that had been abandoned for 2,000 years. This recovery of the past was itself a kind of survival, a preservation and renewal not unlike the flood narratives themselves. Knowledge that had been buried was brought back to light. Voices that had been silent for millennia spoke again. The process of learning to read cuneiform was painstaking and incremental. In the 19th century, scholars could identify some signs and gradually build up knowledge of the script through comparison of texts and careful study. By the middle of the 20th century, cuneiform had been fully deciphered, and the texts of ancient Mesopotamia began to yield their meanings. The discovery of the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh was particularly significant, for it contained copies of texts from earlier periods, preserving works that would otherwise have been lost. The 11 tablets containing the standard version of the Gilgamesh epic, written in the 7th century before the Common Era, but copying a text that was already over 1,000 years old at that time, gave scholars access to the most complete version of the epic that had survived from antiquity. As these texts were translated and studied, scholars began to recognize patterns and connections. The flood narrative in the Gilgamesh epic was clearly related to the earlier Atrahasis epic, which in turn showed connections to the Sumerian flood stories. Scholars could trace how the narrative had been transmitted, adapted, and incorporated into different literary contexts over the course of more than 1,000 years. They could see how the same basic story had been told and retold, copied and recopied, changed and refined by different scribes in different cities and different periods. The transmission of the text through time became visible, encoded in the variations between different versions, in the annotations and corrections made by ancient scribes, in the fragments that preserved portions of older versions that later texts had superseded. The discovery of the connection between the Mesopotamian flood narratives and the Hebrew flood narrative in the Book of Genesis created considerable scholarly attention and debate. Conservative religious scholars, concerned to protect the authority and uniqueness of the biblical text, sometimes dismissed the parallels as superficial or argued that the biblical narrative must have come first, but the evidence pointed in the opposite direction. The Mesopotamian texts were older, dating to the 2nd and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, while the Hebrew scriptures as we know them were composed and edited in the 1st millennium, with the priestly source that contained the flood narrative likely dating to the period of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century before the Common Era. Rather than seeing this connection as a diminishment of the biblical narrative, many modern scholars have come to view it as evidence of the deep roots of Hebrew tradition in the broader culture of the ancient Near East. The Hebrews did not emerge out of isolation, but were always in dialogue with their neighbours, always in contact with the cultures around them. The adoption and adaptation of the flood narrative was not a borrowing of mythology, but an engagement with the shared intellectual heritage of the ancient world. Hebrew scribes recognized in the Mesopotamian flood stories something that resonated with their own experience and their own theological understanding. They took the structure and many details from the older traditions, but they transformed the narrative completely through the lens of Hebrew monotheism and Hebrew theology. In the decades following the decipherment of cuneiform, flood narratives from other ancient cultures began to be studied in comparative perspective. Scholars recognized that the flood motif appeared with striking frequency across many different traditions, separated by vast distances and with no clear mechanism of transmission. This observation led to increased interest in explaining the flood narratives as responses to genuine historical or environmental experiences. The catastrophic flooding that periodically devastated Mesopotamian cities was clearly real and traumatic. The post-glacial sea level rise that transformed coastal regions worldwide was documented in geological studies. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis offered an intriguing possibility for a specific event that could have triggered flood narratives in multiple cultures. Yet even as scholars work to identify historical or environmental bases for the flood narratives, others emphasize the universal or archetypal dimensions of the flood motif. In the field of comparative mythology, developed by scholars like Joseph Campbell, the flood was recognized as one of the great archetypal narratives that appeared across cultures, alongside the hero's journey, the creation myth, the descent to the underworld, and others. These archetypal narratives were understood to arise from the basic structures of human experience and consciousness. The flood, in this interpretation, represents the return of chaos, the dissolution of order, the undoing of creation. It appears in many cultures not because they all experienced the same historical event, but because the flood is a natural symbol of catastrophic loss and the possibility of renewal, a narrative that helps human beings process and understand the transience of all things and the possibility of beginning again. This perspective does not negate the historical and environmental explanations for flood narratives. Rather, it suggests that these different levels of explanation work together. Human communities living in flood-prone regions would indeed develop flood narratives based on their own experiences of catastrophic inundation. These narratives, grounded in actual environmental experiences, would also resonate with the universal archetypal pattern of destruction and renewal. The combination of historical reality and archetypal significance would make the flood narrative particularly powerful and memorable, particularly likely to be transmitted across generations and across cultural boundaries. In the latter, 20th and early 21st centuries, as information became increasingly digital and accessible, the study of the ancient flood narratives expanded to include perspectives from fields that had not previously engaged closely with the texts. Climate scientists studying past climate patterns recognized in the flood narratives possible records of ancient environmental changes. Psychologists interested in trauma and resilience saw in the flood narratives patterns of psychological response to catastrophic events. Anthropologists studying cultural transmission examined how flood narratives circulated and changed as they moved between cultures. Environmental historians used the flood narratives as evidence about the relationship between ancient peoples and their environment. The ancient texts, preserved in clay for thousands of years and then translated and studied by modern scholars, continued to speak to contemporary concerns and to yield new meanings as different interpretive frameworks were brought to bear upon them. In the early 21st century, as concerns about climate change and rising sea levels grew more acute, the flood narratives took on new relevance for many people. The ancient stories of a world threatened by rising water, of catastrophic inundation, of the need for preparation and adaptation seemed suddenly to speak to contemporary anxieties. The image of the Ark, a vessel carrying a remnant of life through waters that covered the earth, was invoked in discussions of how humanity might preserve knowledge and culture in the face of environmental collapse. The figure of Noah or Utnapishtim, warned by a divine being and taking action despite the skepticism of those around, became a symbol for those working on climate change and environmental issues who felt that their warnings were not being heeded, that humanity was failing to prepare for a catastrophe that was slowly becoming inevitable. The flood narratives also raised questions about what it means to survive a world-ending catastrophe. What knowledge and skills matter most? What aspects of culture and tradition are worth preserving? How do communities rebuild after everything has been destroyed? These questions, which had been abstract and theoretical when posed in relation to ancient myths, suddenly seemed urgent and practical when applied to the real possibility of climate catastrophe and environmental collapse. The ancient flood stories offered no concrete answers to these modern questions, but they offered a framework for thinking about them, a way of imagining how humans might respond to overwhelming disaster. The manuscripts and tablets that preserve the flood narratives from antiquity tell their own stories of preservation and loss, of human effort to ensure that knowledge and meaning would survive. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia, inscribed by scribes working by lamplight in temple libraries, were preserved through accident of history when cities were burned and their ruins protected the tablets from erosion. The parchment manuscripts of Hebrew and Christian tradition were copied and recopied by monks and scribes, each generation ensuring that the text would be available to the next, sometimes annotating the text with their own understanding, sometimes simply performing the mechanical task of reproduction. These efforts to preserve were not motivated by any conscious desire to speak to people thousands of years in the future, yet they ensured that the flood narratives would be available to modern readers, that the voice of ancient peoples would not be silenced by time. The journey of the flood narrative from its origins in the experiences of ancient Mesopotamian peoples through its incorporation into the literature and religion of many civilizations to its rediscovery and reinterpretation by modern scholars is a remarkable testament to the power of story. A narrative that began as a way of making sense of a local flood, or perhaps a memory of a regional catastrophe, became a foundational myth for multiple civilizations. It was written down, preserved, transmitted, adapted, and eventually spread across the globe through the spread of the religions and cultures that carried it. In the modern world, it is studied by scholars of many disciplines, referenced in popular culture, invoked in discussions of environmental catastrophe, and appreciated as a work of literature and an expression of timeless human concerns. Each version of the flood narrative that has survived from antiquity preserves the particular understanding of the culture that produced it. The Sumerian version emphasizes the power of the gods and the contingency of human existence. The Akkadian version explores the relationship between gods and humans, the possibility of divine mercy even in the midst of divine judgment. The Babylonian version, as incorporated into the Gilgamesh epic, connects the flood to the larger question of human mortality and the search for meaning in the face of death. The Hebrew version transforms the narrative through monotheistic theology, emphasizing God's justice, the moral dimension of human action, and the covenant that binds God and humanity. The Greek version adapts the narrative to Greek mythological frameworks and philosophical concerns. The Indian version integrates the flood into a cosmological understanding of eternal cycles of creation and destruction. The Chinese version emphasizes human agency and virtue in response to natural disaster. Yet beneath all these variations, a recognizable core remains: a world threatened with destruction, a divine warning to a righteous person, the preservation of a remnant of life, the eventual restoration of the world, a new relationship between the divine and human, often marked by a covenant or promise, the resilience of human civilization, the possibility of renewal and continuation. These elements, repeated across cultures and centuries, suggest something fundamental about how humans understand their place in the cosmos and their capacity to survive and persist even in the face of overwhelming disaster. The preservation of the flood narratives also represents a victory against the entropy that threatens all human works. Everything that humans create, every building and city, every written word, every artistic achievement, is subject to decay and destruction. Fire can burn it, water can wash it away, earthquakes can shake it to ruins. Time itself, the patient passage of years and centuries and millennia, can erase it. Yet the flood narrative survived. The clay tablets were buried and protected by the same destruction that could have destroyed them completely. The manuscripts were copied and recopied, passing from one scribe's hands to another's, each generation ensuring the next would have the text. The stories were remembered and told, alive in human memory and voice even when the written texts were lost. In this sense, the flood narratives are not merely records of a past catastrophe. They are themselves examples of survival, of human determination to preserve what matters, of the power of story to endure beyond the moment of its creation. Today, the flood narratives exist in many forms. Scholars study them in academic contexts, analyzing their structure, their historical context, their theological meanings. Believers in various religious traditions hold them as sacred texts, as records of God's activity in history, as sources of spiritual wisdom and moral guidance. Children hear versions of the story as part of their cultural or religious education. Artists and writers reference the flood narrative, creating new works that engage with the ancient story. The general public encounters the flood narrative through films, television, literature, and popular culture, often without being fully aware of the ancient sources from which the story derives. The flood narrative, in all its various forms, continues to circulate through modern culture, continuing to speak to modern concerns, continuing to generate new interpretations and adaptations. The work of preserving and transmitting the flood narratives continues today, as it has for thousands of years. Archaeologists continue to excavate ancient sites, uncovering new fragments of texts, finding new versions of old stories. Scholars continue to study the texts, discovering new connections and meanings. Translators continue to render the ancient words into modern languages, making the stories accessible to new audiences. Libraries and archives preserve the manuscripts and texts, ensuring they will be available for future study. Educational institutions teach the flood narratives as part of the study of ancient history, literature, religion, and culture. The flood narrative is kept alive through all these efforts, transmitted from past to present and forward into the future, a living tradition that connects us to the ancient world and to all the peoples who have found meaning in this story. As you lie in the darkness tonight, let your mind rest on the thought of all those who have told and retold this story across the millennia. Imagine the scribes in the great libraries of Mesopotamia, their hands stained with the dust of clay, carefully pressing the stylus into tablets to record the words that had been sung and spoken for generations before they were written down. Imagine the Hebrew scribes in Babylon, far from home, preserving their traditions in a foreign land, adapting the stories they had learned to express their faith and understanding. Imagine the monks in medieval monasteries, copying manuscripts by candlelight, preserving the flood narrative through centuries of darkness and change. Imagine the 19th century archaeologists carefully excavating the ruins of ancient cities, discovering tablets that had lain in the earth for thousands of years, becoming the first people in 2 millennia to read the words that ancient scribes had written. All of these people, separated by centuries and continents, were engaged in the same essential work, preserving stories, ensuring that the voices of the past would not be silenced by time, maintaining the connection between the ancient world and the world of their own time. Their efforts resulted in the survival of the flood narratives, which continue to be available to us, which continue to speak to us, which continue to help us understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. The same impulse that drove them drives us. The desire to understand what happened in the past, to learn from the experiences of those who came before, to preserve what matters for those who will come after. The flood narratives remind us that we are part of a continuous human story, a story that stretches back thousands of years and will extend forward into the future. We are heirs to the wisdom and experience of countless generations who have faced floods, droughts, wars, famines, and other disasters, who have survived these catastrophes and rebuilt their lives. We inherit the traditions they preserved, the stories they told, the lessons they learned. We are also responsible for preserving and transmitting this inheritance to future generations, for ensuring that the voices of the past continue to be heard, for adapting the old stories to speak to new times while maintaining their essential truth. The night grows late, and sleep begins to draw near. The stars wheel slowly across the sky, the same stars that shone on the ancient peoples who first told the flood story, the same stars that will shine on peoples yet unborn. The rivers continue their eternal flow, sometimes gentle and life-giving, sometimes swollen with water and dangerous, but always continuing, always carrying forward. The earth beneath you remains steady, solid, the foundation of all life, the place where the deluge receded and where new growth emerged after the waters had passed. Tomorrow will bring its own tasks and challenges, its own difficulties and joys, but tonight, rest knowing that you are part of a long human history of survival and renewal. The ancient peoples who told the flood story have passed into silence. Their cities are dust, their languages are dead, but their stories live on, passed from mouth to mouth, from tablet to parchment to printed page to digital screen, continuing to carry meaning across the ages. Let your breathing become slow and deep, matching the rhythm of waves upon a shore, the rhythm of tides that rise and fall, the rhythm of seasons that turn and return. The world has survived its trials, civilizations have risen and fallen, yet knowledge has persisted, preserved in stories and traditions. Let this knowledge settle into your consciousness as you drift towards sleep, the knowledge that humans are resilient, that meaning can survive catastrophe, that the story of survival and renewal is not merely an ancient tale, but the recurring pattern of human history. Rest assured that the morning will come, that life will continue, that the story that has been told and retold for thousands of years will be told again, carried forward by all those who hear it and pass it on. May your sleep be peaceful and deep, like the waters after the flood has receded, clear and calm and full of the promise of renewal. May you dream of ancient cities and lost civilizations, of scribes bending over their tablets, of stories that persist through time, of the enduring power of human meaning and human connection. And when you wake, may you carry with you the knowledge that you are part of this great continuous story, that you too are a keeper of tradition, a transmitter of meaning, a voice in the long conversation that stretches back to the earliest days of human consciousness, and forward into a future you cannot see but toward which you move with each passing day. The flood has receded, the world has emerged from the waters, life continues, and the stories that were preserved through the deluge continue to be told, continue to teach, continue to move through human consciousness like water flowing downward, carrying with them the voices and wisdom of all those who came before, rest now, knowing that you are held within this great stream of human tradition and human meaning, that the past rests peacefully within the earth, and that tomorrow waits with its own steady rhythm and its own promise of continuation and renewal.